This is a compilation of over 2 hours of Elder Scrolls history explained. So sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. Let's kick things off with every era in Elder Scrolls timeline explained. The Elder Scrolls timeline spans thousands of years of war, betrayal, and divine catastrophe. But the wildest part, the very first era isn't even an era at all. Time literally didn't exist yet. So today, I'm breaking down every single era in the Elder Scrolls timeline and everything that makes them matter. Starting with the one that broke reality before reality was even a thing, the Dawn era. Before there was anything, there was everything and nothing simultaneously, which is, not ideal for anyone trying to write a history book. The Dawn era is the period before linear time existed, and I need you to sit with that for a second. There was no before and after, no cause and effect. What existed instead was the Orbis, a realm of pure possibility born from two cosmic forces. Anu, the principle of absolute stasis, and Padme, the principle of absolute chaos. Where they overlap, things could potentially exist, but nothing was locked in. Imagine the universe as a rough draft nobody had committed to yet. Within this soup of infinite maybes, spirits called the Et'Ada drifted without form or purpose, and that's where Lorkhan enters the picture. Here's the thing about Lorkhan. He wanted to build something real, a mortal plane called Mundus, where beings could live, die, and experience existence. Sounds noble, right? Except he forgot to mention one tiny detail to the spirits he recruited. Building Mundus would cost them a significant portion of their divine power permanently. The Aedra, the spirits who agreed to help, poured their essence into creating the mortal world. By the time they realized what they'd given up, it was too late. Lorkhan had essentially tricked the gods into crippling themselves to build his passion project. The entire mortal world is, at its core, a cosmic crime scene built on divine betrayal. Not everyone stuck around for the fallout. The Magna J, lesser spirits who had helped construct Mundus, fled back to Aetherius, and in doing so, punched holes through the fabric of reality. Those holes? That's where magic comes from. Every spell cast in every Elder Scrolls game is only possible because a bunch of spirits panicked and ran away so hard they tore the sky open. Now, the remaining Aedra wanted justice. They gathered at the Adamantine Tower for an event called the Convention. This is the single most important moment in Elder Scrolls lore. They judged Lorkhan, found him guilty, and ripped his heart out. They flung it across the continent, where it landed and formed Red Mountain in Morrowind. That heart would become the most fought-over object in Tamriel's history. But the Convention did something even bigger. Auriel, the Aedric spirit of time, imposed linear time itself. Before the Convention, events didn't flow in sequence. After it, they did. The Dawn era ended not because something dramatic happened within time, but because time itself was switched on. The Aedra then withdrew, too weakened and too bitter to intervene in mortal affairs. This is why the gods in Elder Scrolls don't just show up and fix things. They can't. They gave too much of themselves to a world they were tricked into building, and now mortals are left to figure it out alone. That tension between divine absence and mortal agency defines literally everything that comes next. But the first civilization to deal with it, they had problems of their own. The Merethic era. The Merethic era is where everything you've ever looted, explored, or accidentally stumbled into at level 3 actually happened. Every Dwemer ruin, every ancient Nord tomb, every crumbling Ayleid city, all of it traces back to this 2,500-year stretch where elves ran the entire continent and humans weren't even on the map yet. This is the first age of linear time, MA 2500 to ME1, and for most of it, the Aldmer, the ancient elves, had near total dominance over Tamriel. They weren't just living there, they were building monuments to their own supremacy. The Durrani clan seized the Adamantine Tower, the oldest structure in existence. The High Elves constructed the Crystal Tower on Somerset Isle as the magical and political heart of their civilization. And then, in Cyrodiil, they raised the White Gold Tower, which would eventually become the seat of every human empire that followed. These weren't just buildings. Each tower functioned as a magical anchor connecting the mortal realm of Mundus to the divine planes. Basically giant metaphysical tent poles holding reality together, which is, not ideal if someone ever knocks one down. As the Aldmer spread across the continent, they split into distinct populations. The Ayleids, sometimes called the Heartland High Elves, flourished in Cyrodiil's jungles, preserving Dawn-era magic and building sprawling underground cities that players still get lost in today. The Dwemer went full mad scientist, carving entire civilizations into mountain ranges and devoting themselves to metaphysical experimentation so aggressive it would eventually erase them from existence entirely. And the Snow Elves occupied Skyrim's northern territories, living relatively peacefully above ground. For now, here's where it gets interesting. Around ME 1 a man named Ysgramor and his people arrived at Sarek Head, the northern tip of Skyrim, fleeing civil war on the frozen continent of Atmora. They founded the city of Sarthal, and for a while, things were fine. Humans and elves coexisted. Then the Atmorans discovered something buried beneath Sarthal, the Eye of Magnus, an artifact of such immense, unknowable power that the elves decided coexistence was no longer an option. The Night of Tears followed. The elves launched a devastating assault on Sarthal, slaughtering nearly every human in the settlement. Ysgramor and his 2 sons barely escaped with their lives, fleeing back to Atmora. This single event is the inciting incident for basically every human-elf conflict in the entire Elder Scrolls franchise. Every grudge, every war, every racial tension between men and Mer traces back to this night. But Ysgramor didn't stay gone. He returned with the 500 companions, and they did not come to negotiate. They conquered Skyrim from the elves systematically, driving them out of territory after territory. The Snow Elves made their last stand at the Battle of the Mosring, where their leader, the Snow Prince, was killed. The survivors, desperate and broken, fled underground to the Dwemer for protection. The Dwemer took them in, and then slowly, deliberately, turned them into the Falmer, blind, twisted, feral creatures enslaved in the dark. So that worked out great for everyone. Meanwhile, the Nords had their own problems. Dragon priests had established tyrannical rule over human civilization, enforcing obedience through the Thu'um and draconic authority. For a time, the dragons were gods, and the Nords were subjects. But the Dragon War changed everything. The rebellion was brutal and initially hopeless, but the Nords eventually overthrew the dragon priests, liberated themselves from draconic dominion, and established independence as a civilization. Every dragon burial mound you walk past in Skyrim is a monument to this war. The Merethic era ends quietly, all things considered. In ME1, King Eplir founded the Cameron dynasty in Valenwood, marking the transition from mythic history into formal recorded history and the beginning of the First Era. The age of gods and monsters was over. The age of empires was about to begin. But if you think the elves losing Skyrim was the end of their problems, the First Era is about to make things so much worse. The First Era is where everything changes. Not gradually, not politely, but through blood, fire, and a deal with a god that would echo for thousands of years. It officially begins in 1E0 with the founding of the Cameron dynasty by King Eplir of Valenwood, which is a nice enough starting point. But the real story of the First Era isn't about Valenwood. It's about Cyrodiil. It's about slavery. And it's about one woman who decided she'd had enough. For centuries, the Ayleids ruled Cyrodiil with absolute authority. These were the Heartland High Elves, a sophisticated civilization that built White Gold Tower and preserved ancient magics from the Dawn Era. Sounds impressive, right? Here's the thing. They were also Daedra worshippers, who maintained their empire on the backs of enslaved humans. The Needies and other races of men lived under Ayleid rule for generations, subjected to treatment that the surviving accounts describe as genuinely horrific. Cool, great civilization. Then, in 1I 242, a young Nedic slave named Alessia, from a tribe near Sardavar Lead, received what the histories call divine inspiration. She climbed a hill, received a vision, and came back down with a plan to organize every enslaved human on the continent into a coordinated uprising against their Ayleid masters. And she actually pulled it off. By 1E 243, the rebellion had captured White Gold Tower itself and overthrown the Ayleid hegemonies entirely. Alessia proclaimed herself the first empress of Cyrodiil, but she didn't just take a throne. She established a divine covenant between men and Akatosh, the dragon god of time. This wasn't symbolic. This covenant would legitimize every single human emperor for thousands of years afterward. Every dynasty that followed traced its authority back to this moment, back to one former slave standing in a conquered tower making a promise with a god. That's not a political event. That's the foundation of an entire civilization. The Alessian reform followed, restructuring religious practice across the empire around the worship of the 9 divines and building a unified cultural identity for human populations that had previously existed as scattered, enslaved groups with no shared framework. Humanity went from property to empire in a single generation, and the empire kept growing. In 1E 1029, Empress Hestra defeated Styrish, the vampire king of Verkarth, and his Grey Host army, pushing them westward until Banquerai's defenders finished the job. High Rock was peacefully incorporated into the Alessian Empire, just casually adding entire provinces to the collection. But here's where it gets genuinely eerie. In 1E 700, something happened that nobody has been able to explain in over 20 years of Elder Scrolls lore. The entire Dwemer race vanished, every single one of them, simultaneously. During the Battle of Red Mountain, their chief tonal architect Kagranak used his profane tools, Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard, to tap directly into the heart of Lorkhan, the heart of the god whose punishment literally created the world. And then every Dwemer on the planet blinked out of existence in a single instant. Their cities remained, their automata automatons kept running. Their traps kept killing adventurers thousands of years later. But the people? Gone. The only known survivor was Yagrum Bagarn, and that's only because he was traveling in the outer realms when it happened and missed the whole thing. Nobody knows if the Dwemer died, transcended, got erased from reality, or something worse. It's one of gaming's greatest unsolved mysteries, and Bethesda has never given a definitive answer. The First Era continued for another 2,200 years after that. The Rayman dynasty eventually succeeded the Alessians when Rayman Cyrodiil defeated invading Akaviri hordes and reunited High Rock and Skyrim under Imperial authority, claiming direct lineage to Saint Alessia herself. The Raymans maintained the Empire's power and expanded its reach for centuries. But dynasties don't last forever. The First Era ends in 1E 2920 with the assassination and collapse of the Rayman dynasty, closing out nearly 3,000 years of history. An era that began with humans in chains, ended with humans ruling the continent. Not bad. But the power vacuum left behind? That's where things get ugly, because the Second Era has a different kind of story to tell. The Second Era spans 896 years, and almost nobody talks about it, which is wild because it contains one of the most devastating single events in the entire Elder Scrolls timeline. One night, one coordinated hit, and an entire continent broke for over 4 centuries. Here's what happened. After the Rayman dynasty fell at the end of the First Era, power didn't just transfer cleanly to someone else. Instead, the Akaviri potentates took over as stewards of the imperial throne, essentially keeping the lights on while nobody with real legitimacy sat in the big chair. It wasn't ideal, but it was functional. Tamriel had leadership. The provinces had someone to answer to. Things held together. Then came the night of Sun's Dawn, 2E 430. The Morag Tong, operating under direct orders from the Night Mother herself, assassinated the last Akaviri potentate, Severian Korak, along with every single one of his known heirs. Not one, not most, all of them. In a single coordinated strike, the imperial line was rendered completely extinct. There was no successor, no backup plan, no distant cousin hiding in a farmhouse somewhere. The throne was empty, and nobody had a legitimate claim to fill it. This initiated the Interregnum, a 424-year stretch from 2E 430 to 2E 854, where Tamriel had zero unifying authority. 424 years. For context, that's roughly the same length of time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the First Crusade. And it all started because one organization had a really productive evening. But here's where it gets interesting. The Morag Tong, the very group that pulled off the assassination, didn't exactly thrive in the aftermath. They transformed. Without a divine mandate driving their purpose, the organization fractured and evolved into something players know very, very well. The Dark Brotherhood. The shift was fundamental. The Morag Tong operated on religious authority, killing because the Night Mother commanded it. The Dark Brotherhood turned assassination into a business, murder as a service, which is, not ideal. But it did make them one of the most recognizable factions in Elder Scrolls history, so at least there's a silver lining. Sort of. Meanwhile, Tamriel was in pieces. Morrowind city-states governed themselves. High Rock's kingdoms squabbled over borders. Valenwood's Cameron holdings maintained their ancient territorial claims. The Somerset Isles operated in splendid isolation. Skyrim's Nordic kingdoms developed their own traditions and power structures free from any imperial standardization. Every region basically looked around, said, guess we're doing this ourselves now, and got on with it. 4 centuries of independent cultural development meant that by the time someone finally reunified the continent, these regions had identities so deeply entrenched that no amount of imperial bureaucracy would ever fully erase them. And then, after 424 years of chaos, a figure emerged who would become arguably the most important person in Elder Scrolls history. Tiber Septim started as the general of Khulakain, a regional ruler with ambitions of his own. When Khulakain died under circumstances that historians have politely described as suspicious, Tiber assumed command, and then he did something nobody had managed in over 4 centuries. He conquered Tamriel, not through diplomacy, not through compromise, through extraordinary military genius and what can only be described as sheer unstoppable force of will. Province by province, kingdom by kingdom, he dragged a fractured continent back together whether it wanted to come or not. In 2E 854, Tiber Septim formally established the Third Empire and declared the beginning of a new era. The Interregnum was over. The throne had an occupant again, and the man sitting on it would eventually be worshipped as a god. But the empire Tiber built? It wasn't going to have a smooth ride either. The Third Era. For 433 years, one family held the entire continent together. One bloodline, one throne, one amulet. The Septim dynasty didn't just rule Tamriel during the Third Era, they defined it. Imperial authority stretched across all 9 provinces, and for the first time in history, the continent operated under a single unified government that actually lasted. Not for a few decades, not for a generation, but for over 4 centuries. If you've played Morrowind or Oblivion, this is the era you lived in. This is the one that feels like home. And the thing holding all of it together wasn't wasn't just an army or a bureaucracy, it was a necklace. The Amulet of Kings was an ancient Ayleid artifact, a red diamond at its center surrounded by 8 gems representing the 8 divines. Back in 1E 266, Shizar imbued it with the soul of Empress Alessia herself, transforming it from a piece of royal jewelry into something far more dangerous and far more important. The amulet served 2 functions. First, it was the symbol of imperial legitimacy. If you couldn't wear it, you weren't the real emperor, period. Second, and this is the part nobody appreciates enough, it was a load-bearing cosmic artifact. The Amulet of Kings maintained a magical barrier between Mundus and Oblivion, physically preventing Daedric princes from invading the mortal world. So it wasn't just a crown jewel, it was the keystone holding the arch of civilization in place. Now, 433 years is a long time, and the Septums weren't immune to the occasional family squabble. In 3E 121, a lovely little conflict called the War of the Red Diamond broke out when Uriel Septim III declared that Kintyra II was a bastard and tried to seize the throne for himself. It was messy, it was violent, and it was one of the only times the dynasty faced a serious internal challenge. But here's the thing, it resolved. The Septim line survived. The amulet stayed intact. The empire kept going, just a bump in the road, which makes what happened next so much worse. In 3E 433, a fanatical cult called the Order of the Mythic Dawn, devoted to the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, assassinated Emperor Uriel Septim VII. And not just him, they killed every single one of his known heirs. Every one. Then they started opening rifts between Mundus and Oblivion, and Daedric forces poured through for a full-scale invasion of Tamriel. Oblivion gates opened across the continent. Cities burned. The barrier that had protected the mortal world for thousands of years was failing because the bloodline that sustained it was being erased. But there was one heir nobody knew about. Martin Septim was the emperor's illegitimate son, a priest living in Kvatch who had zero interest in politics, zero interest in thrones, and absolutely zero preparation for what was about to land on him. He never wanted to be emperor. He didn't even know he was one, but he was the last person alive with Septim blood, which made him the only person capable of using the Amulet of Kings. During the final confrontation at the Temple of the One, with Mehrunes Dagon physically manifesting in the Imperial City, Martin made a choice that still hits harder than almost anything else in Elder Scrolls. He crushed the Amulet of Kings, shattered it, and in doing so, he invoked the Avatar of Akatosh, transforming into a divine dragon of pure light and personally battling a Daedric prince in the streets of the capital. He won. He sealed the connection between Oblivion and Mundus forever, and then he died. Martin's sacrifice didn't just end the Oblivion crisis. It ended everything. The Septim bloodline, gone. The Amulet of Kings, destroyed. The divine covenant between men and Akatosh that had sustained imperial legitimacy since Alessia, erased. The cosmic barrier preventing Daedric invasion, permanently removed. A man who never wanted to be emperor gave literally everything to save a world that barely knew he existed. And the world he saved woke up the next morning with no emperor, no amulet, and no divine protection. The most catastrophic power vacuum in Tamrielic history, which is, not ideal. But if you think the aftermath of that sounds bad, wait until you see what the Fourth Era actually did with it. The Fourth Era doesn't begin with a coronation or a treaty or even a proper announcement. It begins with a death. The exact second Martin Septim shatters the Amulet of Kings and transforms into the Avatar of Akatosh to banish Mehrunes Dagon, the Third Era ends. No transition period, no preparation, no successor waiting in the wings. Just a dead emperor, a broken amulet, and an entire continent suddenly missing the two things that held it together for over 500 years. High Chancellor Okato, the Elder Council, and the Blades scrambled to maintain order. But here's the thing. The Amulet of Kings wasn't just a symbol. It was the mechanism. The divine covenant between men and Akatosh, the barrier preventing Oblivion from freely invading Mundus, the source of imperial legitimacy itself. All of it gone. And without it, every crack in the empire that had been papered over for centuries started splitting wide open. The dominoes fell fast. In 4E5, Red Mountain erupted in Morrowind, not a minor eruption, a province-ending cataclysm that devastated the Dunmer homeland and displaced thousands. And while the Dunmer were still choking on ash, the Argonians of Black Marsh saw their opportunity. Former slaves of the Dunmer for centuries, the Argonians invaded southern Morrowind, sacked the capital city of Mournhold, killed thousands, and forced the entire seat of government to relocate to Blacklight. The High King of Skyrim granted the island of Solstheim to Morrowind's refugees, which was generous, but it wasn't exactly a replacement for an entire province. Cool, that's also a thing that happened. Meanwhile, on the Somerset Isles, the Thalmor were making their move, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. During the Oblivion Crisis, while the Empire was barely surviving Mehrunes Dagon's invasion, the Thalmor were taking notes. When it was over, they claimed credit for ending the crisis entirely. Whether that's true or a masterful piece of propaganda doesn't really matter, because the Altmer population believed it. it. By 4E22, the Thalmor had seized total control of Somerset Isle, renamed it Alinor, purged non-Altmeri populations and political dissidents, and established an authoritarian regime that would become the single most dangerous power on the continent. They essentially built a fascist state while everyone else was still putting out fires. Back in Cyrodiil, things were somehow getting worse. High Chancellor Okato was assassinated somewhere between 4E15 and 4E22, and with him went the last thread of centralized authority. The Elder Council fractured. Civil war erupted as pretenders fought for the Ruby Throne in what historians call the Stormcrown Interregnum, which, if you've been paying attention, should sound familiar, because this is exactly what happened during the Second Era's Interregnum. Same pattern, same chaos, same power vacuum. Tamriel apparently learns nothing. By the time Emperor Titus Mede II finally took the throne in 4E168, the empire he inherited was barely recognizable. Valenwood and Elsewhere had been absorbed by the Thalmor's Aldmeri dominion. Black Marsh had declared independence. Morrowind was still a smoking ruin. Hammerfell was consumed by internal civil war between the Crown and Forebear factions. The empire that once spanned 9 provinces now controlled maybe 4 on a good day. Emperor was starting to feel like a generous job title. And then came 4E201. Ulfric Stormcloak, Jarl of Windhelm, challenged High King Torrig and killed him with the Thu'um, just shouted him apart. Ulfric declared the Stormcloak Rebellion with a very specific list of demands. Remove the Imperial Legion from Skyrim, crown himself High King, lift the ban on Talos worship, expel every Thalmor Justiciar operating in the province, and, independently, prepare for war with the Aldmeri Dominion. If you've played Skyrim, you walk directly into the middle of this. You were literally on the chopping block because of it, and that's where we are. The Fourth Era remains unfinished. It's an open wound. Every single institution that once held Tamriel together, the Amulet of Kings, the Dragonborn Bloodline, the Septim Dynasty, the Elder Council, the Unified Imperial Legion, has been dismantled, destroyed, or fractured beyond recognition. The trajectory doesn't point toward restoration. It points toward more fragmentation, more ideological conflict, more factions carving out their own corners of a continent that nobody can hold together anymore. If you trace the full arc of the 6 Ages, from the Dawn Era to now, you see a clear descent. Primordial gods creating reality, divine covenants forging empires, those empires rising and falling, and finally arriving here. A fractured, mortal world where no god is coming to fix things, no amulet to relight, no covenant to restore, just people fighting over what's left. Not all stories have a point, but this one does. The Dragonborn are some of the most powerful beings in Elder Scrolls history. Blessed by Akatosh with the blood and soul of a dragon, they were meant to protect humanity from forces no ordinary mortal could face. But not every Dragonborn answered that call. Some became legends, others became monsters, and the very first one, he became both. Let's start at the beginning, with the one who ruined everything, Miraak. Before there was a Dovahkiin saving the world in Skyrim, there was Miraak, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with saving anyone. The first Dragonborn lived during the Merethic era, back when dragons ruled over humanity and dragon priests served as their enforcers. Miraak was one of those priests. Loyal, powerful, obedient. For a while, anyway. Here's where it gets complicated. At some point during his service, Miraak got his hands on a black book, one of Hermaeus Mora's lovely little doorways into Apocrypha. And Mora, being the tentacled knowledge hoarder that he is, saw an opportunity. He taught Miraak the Bend Will Shout, a Thu'um so powerful it could force dragons themselves into submission, not kill them, literally bend their will to his command, and Miraak did not use this gift politely. He turned on his dragon masters and started devouring their souls. If you visit his temple on Solstheim, you'll find dragon skeletons scattered along the pathway like some kind of horrific lawn decoration. The man was eating dragons the way you and I eat lunch, just casually, on a Tuesday. But here's the kicker. When the Dragon War broke out and ancient Nord heroes came begging for his help against Alduin, the literal world eater, Miraak said no. The one being on the planet specifically designed to protect humanity from dragons looked at the greatest dragon threat in history and said, not my problem, which is, not ideal. His fellow dragon priest Valak eventually challenged him, and the battle was so catastrophic it literally tore Solstheim away from the Skyrim mainland. An entire island ripped from a continent because 2 guys couldn't settle their differences. But before Valak could finish him off, Hermaeus Mora yanked Miraak into Apocrypha, trapping him in a realm of infinite knowledge and zero freedom. And that's the irony that makes Miraak tragic. He rejected his divine burden completely, choosing personal dominion over service. He traded the dragons for a Daedric prince, and spent thousands of years as a prisoner, not emerging until 4E201. The first Dragonborn ended up more enslaved than anyone he could have liberated. Every gift Akatosh could give, squandered for power he never got to use. But if Miraak represents what happens when a Dragonborn rejects their calling, the next next one shows what happens when they embrace it completely. Saint Alessia. Mirac had the blood of a dragon and used it to serve himself. Alessia had the blood of a dragon and used it to free everyone else. And the way she got it is one of the most metal things in all of Elder Scrolls lore. See, Alessia wasn't born Dragonborn. She didn't inherit it. Akatosh, the dragon god of time, literally drew blood from his own divine heart and gave it to her, not as a reward, but as a contract. Covenant. As long as Alessia's bloodline maintained the dragon fires and kept up worship of Akatosh, the gates of oblivion would stay sealed. No Daedric invasions. No hellscape portals opening up in the middle of your Tuesday afternoon. The literal safety of the entire mortal world bound to one woman's bloodline, which is, a bit of pressure. But here's the thing, Alessia didn't just accept this divine burden and sit around looking holy. In 1E 242, she launched the Alessian slave rebellion against the Ayleids, the Heartland High Elves, who had been enslaving humans for centuries. And these weren't your standard oppressors. The Ayleids actively worshipped Daedric forces, using Daedra and undead to keep their human slaves in line. Alessia looked at all of that and said no. By 1E 243, her forces had captured the White Gold Tower itself, and she declared herself the first Empress of Cyrodiil, former slave to Empress in roughly a year. Not bad, but conquering was only half the job. Alessia's empire was a patchwork of different peoples with different gods. The Nords worshipped one pantheon, the Elves followed another, and if she picked a side, the whole thing falls apart before the mortar dries. So she synthesized the Nordic and Aldmeri pantheons into a single unified religion, the Eight Divines, one framework that gave everyone something familiar to hold on to and prevented the kind of religious civil war that would have torn her empire apart in a generation. That's not just military leadership, that's political genius. And then there's her death. On her deathbed, Akatosh himself appeared and bound her soul directly into the Amulet of Kings. Alessia became the first human saint, and the amulet became the physical anchor of the covenant she'd established. For thousands of years after, every emperor who wore it was essentially carrying Alessia's soul around their neck, maintaining the barrier between Tamriel and oblivion through her sacrifice. She didn't just fulfill her divine burden, she became the mechanism. Her soul literally powers the protection of the entire world. Every dragonborn that came after her is measured against what she built, but the next one on our list took that template and turned it into something completely different. Because Riemann Cyrodiil didn't receive his dragonborn status from a god. He received it from an invading army. Riemann Cyrodiil. Every dragonborn we've talked about so far got their confirmation from a god, or discovered it through rebellion. Riemann Cyrodiil got his from an invading army that crossed an entire ocean just to find him. And that's not even the weirdest part. In 1E 2700, the Tsaishi warriors of Akavir launched a full-scale invasion of Tamriel. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a coordinated military campaign from a continent most people in Tamriel had barely heard of. And for 3 years, they carved through everything in their path. Cyrodiil was fractured, disorganized, and completely unprepared. The Colovians and Nibonese couldn't agree on lunch, let alone a unified defense. So naturally, the Akaviri were winning. Enter Raman, a military leader who somehow unified the fractured armies into a single fighting force capable of actually defending the continent, which is, kind of important when snake warriors from another landmass are knocking on your door, but here's where it gets genuinely strange. At the Battle of Pale Pass in 1E 2703, the Akaviri armies heard Raman's voice carry across the battlefield, and instead of fighting harder, they dropped to their knees, every single one of them. They surrendered on the spot and declared him Dragonborn, the chosen one they had actually been searching for this entire time. They didn't invade Tamriel to conquer it. They invaded Tamriel to find him. The entire war was essentially a very aggressive job interview, and Raman passed. Alessia got her confirmation directly from Akatosh. Mirac figured it out through forbidden knowledge and Daedric pacts. Raman had a foreign military force sail across an ocean, fight a 3-year war, and then kneel because they recognized something divine in his voice. That's not how you normally discover your chosen, but here we are. What followed was even more impressive. Rather than executing the surrendered Akaviri, Riemann incorporated them into his forces. These former invaders became his elite military backbone, and with this expanded army, Riemann went on a conquest spree that would make most emperors weep. He founded the Second Empire and annexed High Rock, Skyrim, Valenwood, and the Somerset Isles. Nearly all of Tamriel fell under his banner. The only holdout was Morrowind, because Morrowind has has always been difficult about everything. The Raymond dynasty lasted roughly 200 years, with his heirs maintaining Alessia's covenant with Akatosh. The dragon fires stayed lit, the barrier held. Raymond had taken what Alessia built and stretched it across an entire continent. And then there's the title. Raymond wasn't just called emperor, he was called the worldly god, not a saint like Alessia, a god, a man who spoke on a battlefield and made an entire invasion force surrender through sheer divine nature, then built an empire so vast people literally worshipped him for it. Where Alessia forged the lock, Raymond built a bigger door. But if Raymond's story sounds like the peak of what a Dragonborn can achieve, wait until you hear about the one who took it even further and became an actual god in the pantheon, Tiber Septim. Every Dragonborn before him built something. Tiber Septim built everything, and then he became a god for doing it. Born Hjalti Earlybeard, this man clawed his way from a general serving under King Kulakain of Falkreath to the single most powerful ruler Tamriel has ever seen. He was trained in the Thu'um by the Greybeards themselves, and when the Nordic armies heard him use the voice, they joined him on the spot. From that moment forward, Tiber Septim did not stop conquering until there was literally nothing left to conquer. Here's the thing, every other Dragonborn had limits. Alessia freed humanity but ruled one region. Raymond built an empire but never got Morrowind. Tiber Septim looked at the entire continent and said all of it, through military conquest, political maneuvering, and a level of personal ambition that makes every other emperor look like they were playing on casual difficulty, he systematically dismantled every independent kingdom standing between him and total unification. But even Tiber Septim hit a wall. The Somerset Isles, home of the Altmer, magically advanced, geographically isolated, and historically unconquerable. Every previous empire had simply accepted that the High Elves were off the table, so he activated the Numidium. The Numidium was an ancient Dwemer construct of absolutely incomprehensible destructive power. Think of it as the nuclear option of Elder Scrolls lore, except nuclear weapons don't also break the fabric of reality when you set them off. Tiber Septim pointed it directly at the Somerset Isles without a second of hesitation. Actually, yeah, let's go take the Elf Island too, which is, not ideal for the elves. By 2E 896, Tiber Septim had accomplished what zero Dragonborn before him ever managed: the complete unification of every known territory on Tamriel under a single imperial banner, every province, every kingdom, every stubborn holdout. This ended the interregnum and kicked off the Third Era, a period of relative peace and stability that lasted over 400 years. The man conquered an entire continent, and the result was the longest stretch of peace in recorded history. His methods were brutal and often ruthless, but the outcome speaks for itself. And then he died in 3E38, and that's where the story gets truly insane. After his death, Tiber Septim underwent apotheosis. He didn't just get remembered fondly. He didn't get a statue or a holiday. He became a god. Talos, the ninth divine, added to the pantheon alongside the original 8. He is the only Dragonborn in history to transcend mortality entirely and join the gods as a peer. Alessia became a saint. Raymond became a legend. Tiber Septim became divine. That's not a metaphor. He literally ascended to godhood. His divine burden was conquest and total unification, and he fulfilled it so completely that the universe itself promoted him. Every Dragonborn before him carried a piece of Akatosh's purpose. Tiber Septim carried the whole thing, and then asked for more. But if you think being descended from a literal god would keep his bloodline on the straight and narrow, you clearly haven't met the Wolf Queen, Potema Septim. Most Dragonborn on this list had a divine burden and either rose to meet it or ran from it. Potema Septim looked at hers, laughed, and set it on fire. Born in 3E67 to Emperor Pelagius Septim II, Potema entered the world with dynasty, dragon blood, and every advantage the Septim name could offer. Her grandfather took one look at her as a newborn and declared she appeared as a she-wolf ready to pounce, which is, not the most comforting thing to say about a baby. But the old man wasn't wrong. He was off by exactly 0%, because Potema didn't just grow up ambitious. She grew up to be one of the most destructive forces the Third Empire ever produced. In 3E121, a succession crisis erupted, and Potema saw her opening. Rather than accept her place in the imperial hierarchy, she rallied armies from Skyrim, High Rock, and Northern Morrowind, and personally led forces into battle. The result was the War of the Red Diamond, a 16-year succession conflict that turned the empire into a graveyard. And I don't mean that metaphorically. Entire regions were depopulated, trade routes collapsed, farmland burned, civilians starved in provinces that hadn't seen a soldier in months. Most of the imperial family was murdered during the fighting, which is impressive in the worst possible way. Potema didn't just want the Ruby Throne, she wanted everyone between her and it to stop breathing. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. As the war turned against her, Potema didn't surrender. She pivoted to necromancy. necromancy, and not amateur raise a skeleton or two necromancy. Potema became one of the most accomplished necromancers in Skyrim's entire history, raising full armies of undead to replace her dwindling living forces. Some accounts suggest she pursued Daedric pacts to sustain her campaign, reaching out to powers that would have made Alessia weep. Her divine burden was stewardship, protection. She chose to raise the dead and bargain with darkness instead. She died during the Siege of Solitude in 3E137 at the age of 70, cornered in the very city she'd ruled. 70 years old and still fighting, still refusing to let go of a throne she never actually claimed. You almost have to respect the commitment, almost. But even death might not have been the end of it. Before she died, Potema passed a sinister wolf-shaped pendant to her nephew Pelagius. That nephew went on to become Pelagius III, better known as the Mad Emperor, a ruler so mentally unstable his reign became one of the most infamous disasters in Septim history. Scholars have long debated whether that pendant carried some form of curse, a final act of spite from a woman who couldn't win the throne but could still poison the bloodline that kept it from her. Potema had everything: the blood, the name, the ability. She could have been a stabilizing force for the empire. Instead, she chose to burn it all for a crown she never wore, and historians classify her as unambiguously evil. No asterisks. No, well, from her perspective, just evil. But if Potema represents what happens when a dragonborn chooses destruction from within the bloodline, wait until you hear about someone who may have stolen the blood itself: Mankar Camoran. Mankar Camoran is either the most dangerous dragonborn who ever lived, or the greatest fraud in Elder Scrolls history, and nobody, not the lore community, not Bethesda, not the in-game texts, has ever given us a definitive answer, which makes him the single most unsettling name on this entire list. Here's what we know for sure. Mankar Camoran was the illegitimate son of Camoran the Usurper and his Bosmer mistress Kalis. He was an Altmer who founded the Order of the Mythic Dawn, a Daedric cult dedicated to Mehrunes Dagon, the Prince of Destruction, and in 3E433, he orchestrated the assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and every known Septim heir, triggering the Oblivion Crisis and Mehrunes Dagon's full-scale invasion of Tamriel. That's the single most destructive act any alleged dragonborn ever committed. Not Miraak's rebellion, not Potema's civil war. Camoran literally opened the door for a Daedric prince to walk into the Imperial City. But here's where it gets complicated. The strongest evidence that Mankar Camoran was a real dragonborn? He wore the Amulet of Kings. That's not a piece of jewelry you just throw on. The amulet has absolute restrictions. It slips from the neck of any wearer who doesn't have dragon blood. Every historical account agrees on this. The thing is basically a divine lie detector for dragonborn status, and Camoran passed the test. Then there's his own writing. In the first book of his Mythic Dawn commentaries, Camoran claims that after speaking with another tongue, he could speak fire within 3 nights. 3 nights. Normal mortals train with the Greybeards for years, sometimes decades, to master a single shout. Mastering fire breath in 3 days is described as flatly impossible unless the person already had inherent dragonborn capabilities, unless the power was already inside him, waiting to be unlocked. So, here's the question that has kept the lore community arguing for nearly 20 years. Was he real, or was he a fake? And here's the terrifying part. Both answers are bad. If Mankar Camoran was a genuine dragonborn, that means Akatosh's gift, the same divine blood given to Alessia to protect humanity, can be wielded by someone who wants to burn it all down. It means the Covenant isn't a safeguard. It's just power, and power doesn't care who uses it. A dragonborn can serve a Daedric prince, murder an emperor, and rip open the gates of oblivion while wearing the very amulet designed to keep those gates shut. If he was a fraud, that's arguably worse, because it means Daedric princes can manufacture fake dragonborn. It means Mehrunes Dagon found a way to bypass Akatosh's most sacred restriction, fooling the Amulet of Kings itself. And if one Daedric prince can do it, what's stopping the others? Either way, the foundation cracks. Nobody talks about this enough. Camoran didn't just kill an emperor. He broke the question of what dragonborn even means. Every other name on this list, you can point to their blood, their lineage, their divine moment. With Camoran, you get a question mark. And that question mark brought Tamriel closer to annihilation than any dragon, any war, any necromancer queen ever did. Speaking of the emperor he murdered, let's talk about the man who saw it coming and couldn't stop it, Uriel Septim. 7. Uriel Septim VII ruled Tamriel for 65 years. 65 years on the Ruby Throne, from 3E368 until his assassination in 3E433. He was 87 years old when he died. One of the longest reigns in the entire history of the Empire. And on paper, that sounds like stability. But here's the thing, Uriel's reign wasn't a golden age. It was a slow, quiet collapse dressed up in imperial robes. The first real crack came in 3E 389 when his own imperial battle mage, Jagger Tharn, betrayed him. Tharn used magic to literally imprison the Emperor and replace him on the throne. For 10 years, the real Uriel Septim sat in a magical prison while an imposter wore his face and ran his empire into the ground. Provinces drifted, alliances frayed. The whole structure Tiber Septim had spent a lifetime building started rotting from the inside, and nobody even knew it was happening. It took a figure known as the Eternal Champion to defeat Tharn and restore Uriel to power. And to his credit, Uriel tried. He released the Nerevarine in Morrowind. He worked to reassert imperial authority over territories that had tasted independence during Tharn's usurpation. But the damage was done. 10 years of magical identity theft doesn't exactly patch over easily, and then came the mythic Dawn. In 3E 433, a Daedric cult dedicated to Mehrunes Dagon assassinated Uriel Septim VII, alongside every single one of his known heirs. Everyone. The entire legitimate Septim bloodline, wiped out in a coordinated strike designed to break the Covenant. Without a Dragonborn Emperor to light the dragon fires, the barrier between Tamriel and Oblivion collapsed. Gates tore open across the continent. Daedra poured through. The Oblivion crisis had begun. But there was one heir nobody accounted for. An illegitimate son named Martin Septim, hidden away in a chapel in Kvatch, completely unaware of his bloodline. Martin briefly became the last Septim Emperor. Briefly. Because the only way to stop Mehrunes Dagon from physically manifesting in the Imperial City was for Martin to shatter the Amulet of Kings and channel the power of Akatosh directly through his own body. He did it. He became the avatar of Akatosh, a golden dragon that drove Dagon back into oblivion. And then Martin was gone. The amulet was destroyed. The dragon fires went dark permanently. Alessia's covenant, the divine agreement that had protected Tamriel across 3 entire eras, was over. The Septim dynasty ended not with a whimper, but with the total destruction of everything that had made it divine. Uriel's burden was preservation, and despite 65 years of trying, the forces against him proved overwhelming. He couldn't stop Tharn, he couldn't rebuild what was lost, and he couldn't protect his own children from a cult that wanted to watch the world burn. Sometimes the divine burden isn't about what you accomplish. It's about how long you can hold the walls together before they finally come down. But if the Septim line ended with Martin's sacrifice, and the Amulet of Kings was shattered, and the Covenant was broken, then who exactly showed up 200 years later with the blood of a dragon, and the voice to prove it? The last Dragonborn. Every Dragonborn we've talked about had something behind them. Alessia had a divine covenant and an army of freed slaves. Remen had the Akaviri kneeling at his feet. Tiber Septim had the Numidium and the political machinery of an entire continent. Miraak had forbidden knowledge and a cult of devoted followers. The last Dragonborn had nothing. No army, no dynasty, no empire. Just a prophecy carved into Alduin's wall and a date with the end of the world. In 4E 201, Alduin the World Eater returned, not from some distant realm, but from time itself. The ancient Nord heroes who fought him during the Dragon War couldn't kill him, so they used an Elder Scroll to rip him out of the timeline entirely, punting him forward through the ages like a problem for someone else to deal with. Which is, not ideal for the someone else. That someone else turned out to be an unknown prisoner about to get their head chopped off in Helgen. Alduin's arrival interrupted the execution, and shortly after this, nobody killed the dragon Mirmilnir and absorbed its soul. The Greybeards felt it immediately and shouted Dovahkiin across the land, a summons that echoed from High Hrothgar to every corner of Skyrim. One word. That was the entire job interview. Here's where it gets complicated. To defeat Alduin, the last Dragonborn needed the Dragonrend shout, a technique invented by mortals during the Dragon War, specifically designed to force dragons to comprehend mortality. Dragons are immortal beings. The concept of ending, of not existing, is literally incomprehensible to them. Dragonrend shoves that concept into their minds and it breaks them, temporarily grounds them, makes them vulnerable. But nobody alive knew the shout. So the last Dragonborn used an Elder Scroll to enter the time wound at the throat of the world and witness the original battle against Alduin firsthand. They learned Dragonrend by literally being present at its creation. Then they came back and used it. Alduin. His name translates to Destroyer, Devour, Master. Some scholars consider him not just a servant of Akatosh, Akatosh, but an alternative manifestation of the dragon god of time himself. The entity that created the flow of time might also be the entity destined to end it. The last Dragonborn's divine burden was to stop that from happening, not to build an empire, not to claim a throne, just save everything. And that's what makes the last Dragonborn the most important one on this entire list. Every other Dragonborn had institutional support, political power, or at minimum a religious order backing their play. The last Dragonborn had the Greybeards and a really steep mountain to climb. The divine burden here was the purest version of what Akatosh intended when he first blessed a mortal with dragon blood. No politics, no ambition, just protection. The symmetry is almost too clean. Thousands of years earlier, Miraak was given this exact same gift, the first Dragonborn, blessed by Akatosh, capable of devouring dragon souls, powerful enough to reshape the world, and he refused. He rejected his divine purpose, sold his soul to Hermaeus Mora, and let humanity fend for itself. The last Dragonborn finished what Miraak wouldn't start, an unknown hero with no name, no legacy, and no reason to fight other than the fact that someone had to. Akatosh blessed the first mortal with dragon blood, and that mortal said no. Thousands of years later, he blessed another, and that one said yes. That's the entire story of the Dragonborn. That's the cycle, completed. Every Elder Scrolls protagonist disappears. The heroes who save Tamriel from gods, demons, and apocalyptic threats all share one disturbing pattern. The moment their quest ends, they vanish from history. Some fade into silence. One was erased by time itself. Another became a god. Here's what actually happened to all six, starting with the hero nobody remembers, the Eternal Champion. The first Elder Scrolls hero is the only one who was completely forgotten by the lore. The Eternal Champion spent a decade collecting the 8 pieces of the Staff of Chaos to defeat Jagar Tharn, freed Emperor Uriel Septim VII from a decade of imprisonment in Oblivion, and then just stopped existing in the story. No other game references them. Not Daggerfall, not Morrowind, not Oblivion, not Skyrim, not even ESO, which takes place thousands of years earlier and could have mentioned them as a future legend. Here's what makes this so strange. Early arena materials actually named the protagonist. They called them Talon, born in 3E 370. The Grateful Emperor promised they would rule by his side after saving the Empire, and then Bethesda simply never mentioned them again. The in-game books that discuss Jagar Tharn's coup and the decade he spent impersonating the Emperor never name who stopped him. The brief history of the Empire confirms the Imperial Simulacrum happened. The biography of Queen Baranzaya credits Baranzaya with secretly helping the champion, quote, through the spirit Rhea Silmane. But the champion's identity remained unknown to the public for years, reportedly at Uriel's own insistence. Even Alduin's Wall in Skyrim references the simulacrum in its prophecy, but never mentions the person who ended it. The community's best theory is that Okado of Firsthold, the High Chancellor you meet in Oblivion, might be the Eternal Champion. The evidence includes his extraordinary level of trust with Emperor Uriel, his position literally standing at the Emperor's right hand in the Daggerfall instruction manual, and a timeline that actually works. If the champion was born around 3E 370, they would have been roughly 63 years old by the Oblivion Crisis. Old, but not impossibly old. But that assumes the champion was human. If they were an Altmer or Dunmer, they could have lived centuries. Without a confirmed race, we can't even narrow down their potential lifespan. The Eternal Champion could have died of old age before Morrowind. They could have still been alive during Skyrim. We have literally zero information. Here's the thing. Unlike every protagonist who came after them, the Eternal Champion was not a figure of prophecy. They were not chosen by the gods. They were just the last person left standing when Jagar Tharn's coup killed or imprisoned everyone else. They were a prisoner who happened to get a dream from a dead battle mage's ghost and decided to do something about it. Bethesda adopted a firm policy after Arena of never canonizing player character details like race, gender, or specific actions. The Eternal Champion's total absence from later lore is not a deliberate mystery. It's the first casualty of that design philosophy. They saved the entire empire from a decade of tyranny under an imposter emperor, and history forgot them so thoroughly that we don't even know if they lived to see the next year. At least the later heroes got mentioned in books, or confirmed dead. The Eternal Champion got nothing. They are the most successful protagonist and the most thoroughly erased. The Agent of Daggerfall has the strangest confirmed fate of any Elder Scrolls protagonist. They were not forgotten. They were not lost to history. They were were consumed by a fracture in reality itself. The agent arrived in the Iliac Bay in 3E405 as a Blades operative on what seemed like a routine assignment. Investigate King Lysandas's ghost, recover a sensitive letter for the Emperor. Simple espionage work. But the mission spiraled into something far bigger when the agent discovered that every major power in the region was hunting for the same artifact, the Totem of Tiber Septim, which could control the Numidium, a reality-warping brass god left dormant since the Second Era. Daggerfall gave players 6 different endings. Give the totem to the Empire, give it to one of 3 kings, give it to the necromancer Mannimarco, or give it to the Underking, who wanted to reclaim his stolen soul and finally die. There was even a cut 7th ending where the agent activated the Numidium themselves and got killed by it. Bethesda had to pick one for canon. They picked all of them. On the 9th through 11th of Frostfall, 3E417, the activation of the Numidium triggered a dragon break. This is not a metaphor. The timeline fractured. Akatosh, the dragon god of time, was disrupted. Mutually exclusive events happened simultaneously. The 44 petty kingdoms of the Iliac Bay collapsed into 4 major powers. Mannimarco ascended to godhood and became a constellation. The Underking got his soul back and died. And somehow, impossibly, every version of the totem's fate occurred at once. The in-game book, The Warp in the West, written by Ulvius Tarot and found in both Morrowind and Oblivion, contains the critical line. The Blades filed an official report on the event, and it reads, "We unfortunately lost contact with that agent immediately after the event. His report might have gone some way to resolving the contradictory and paradoxical accounts of the event. The agent stood at the exact center of a temporal paradox where they simultaneously gave the totem to everyone and no one, and they never filed a report. The Blades never heard from them again." Lead designer Ted Peterson confirmed in a 2021 interview that Dragon Breaks were invented specifically to resolve Daggerfall's multiple endings. He called it a little bit of a betrayal of player choice, but acknowledged the narrative necessity. In a 2025 podcast, he admitted Dragon Breaks are really silly, but said he still liked the concept. But here's what matters. That cut ending where the agent activates the Numidium and dies, it became canon alongside everything else. The community overwhelmingly believes the agent is dead. Some theories go darker. The book Where Were You When the Dragon Broke describes the aftermath in apocalyptic terms. Whole armies teleported hundreds of miles. Mass disappearances, firestorms, tsunamis. Witnesses whose eyes were burned out by light nobody could explain. One person standing at the center of all that contradiction may not have simply died. They may have been shattered across the fractured timelines, unable to reconverge when Akatosh repaired himself, erased from existence entirely. The agent is the only Elder Scrolls protagonist with strong canonical evidence of death. The Blades report confirms they vanished the moment the Dragon Break happened. Their report was never delivered, and nobody in the Empire ever saw them again. At least the other heroes got to walk away. The Nerevarine. The Nerevarine has the most poetically tragic fate of any Elder Scrolls hero. They saved Morrowind from a mad god, fulfilled every prophecy, gained literal immortality, and then sailed away and never came back, not even when their people needed them most. The Nerevarine arrived in Morrowind as a prisoner in 3E427. Whether they were actually Nerevar reborn or just someone who happened to fit the prophecy is deliberately left unclear. But they destroyed Dagoth-Ur, killed 2 members of the Tribunal, left Vivek's fate undetermined, and ended the blight threatening all of Vardenfell. The Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition, published 5 years later, states it plainly. The Nerevarine likewise has vanished. 1 year after that, during Oblivion, NPCs across Cyrodiil share a specific rumor. Altmer, Bosmer, and Dunmer all say the same thing. I've heard that the Nerevarine has left on an expedition to Akavir and hasn't been heard from since. This is the only canonical explanation for where they went. 200 years later, in Skyrim's Dragonborn DLC, the Telvanni wizard Neloth casually mentions them while standing on Solstheim. You are too young to remember the Nerevarine. He defeated Dagoth-Ur and saved us all from the Blight. Here's where it gets dark. The Nerevarine is almost certainly still alive. During Morrowind's main quest, you contract Corpus disease. Devaithfire's experimental cure removes the negative effects, the madness, the deformity, but retains the positive ones. Complete immunity to all disease, and immunity to aging itself. The Nerevarine prophecy explicitly states, neither blight nor age can harm him. The last living Dwemer, Yagrum Bagarn, survived thousands of years with Corpus. The Nerevarine carries those same benefits. By the time of Skyrim, the Nerevarine would would be over 200 years old, but biologically, still whatever age they were when fire cured them, probably late 20s, early 30s, functionally ageless, functionally immortal, and completely absent when Morrowind collapsed. In 4E5, Red Mountain erupted in the Red Year, Vardenfell was devastated, Vivec City was destroyed, the Dunmer people were scattered. The prophesied savior of Morrowind, immune to death, immune to disease, immune to time itself, was already gone. In the unofficial but widely referenced text The Fall of Aldarune, the armies of Oblivion destroy the Redoran capital, and the survivors pray for help. The text reads, "Prayers to Vivec and the Nerevarine go unanswered. The hero who saved the Dunmer simply was not there when their entire world burned." Community theories overwhelmingly hold that the Nerevarine is still alive somewhere on Akavir. They were inducted into the Blades by Caius Cosades during the main quest, so it's possible they went as an intelligence operative. A minority theory suggests that Corpus was tied to Dagoth Ur's power through the heart of Lorkhan, and destroying both might have gradually eroded the disease's benefits. Maybe the Nerevarine is mortal again. Maybe they died centuries ago, but nothing in the lore confirms that. The dramatic irony cuts deep. Nerevar was betrayed and murdered by the people he trusted most, the Tribunal. His reincarnation fulfilled every prophecy, saved everyone, and then vanished. History repeated itself in a new key. The Nerevarine walked away, and an entire culture paid the price for their absence. But at least they chose to leave. The hero of Kvatch did not get that luxury. The hero of Kvatch. The hero of Kvatch has the most definitively resolved fate of any Elder Scrolls protagonist, and it is deeply unsettling. After closing every Oblivion Gate, recovering the Amulet of Kings, and watching Martin Septim sacrifice himself to become the avatar of Akatosh, the hero entered the Shivering Isles, the realm of Sheogorath, Daedric Prince of Madness, and they never left as the person they were. The Shivering Isles. DLC revolves around the Grey March, an eternal curse. Every era, at the end of every era, Sheogorath reverts to his original form, Jiggalag, Daedric Prince of Order. Jiggalag then destroys his own realm and every soul in it before the other Daedric princes curse him back into madness. The cycle repeats forever. Sheogorath cannot break it, because he becomes the thing that perpetuates it. The hero of Kvatch broke the cycle by defeating Jiggalag in single combat, and Jiggalag, finally free after millennia, delivered the speech that ends the DLC. "You now hold the mantle of madness, and Jiggalag is free to roam the voids of Oblivion once more. I will take my leave, and you will remain here, mortal." Mortal? King? God? It seems uncertain. Fare thee well, Sheogorath, Prince of Madness. The hero of Kvatch became Sheogorath, not symbolically, not temporarily. They assumed the divine mantle of a Daedric prince, and Skyrim confirms it 200 years later. In Skyrim's quest, The Mind of Madness, the Dragonborn encounters Sheogorath vacationing inside the mind of the long-dead Emperor Pelagius III, and his dialogue is loaded with first-person references to Oblivion's events. He says, "I was there for that whole sordid affair. Marvelous time. Butterflies, blood, a fox, a severed head. Oh, and the cheese." The fox, capitalized, is the Grey Fox from Oblivion's Thieves Guild. The severed head references the Dark Brotherhood questline. The butterflies are from the Shivering Isles entrance sequence. But here's the line that confirms everything. Sheogorath says of Martin Septim, he turned into a dragon god, and that's hardly sporting. The original Sheogorath was transforming into Jiggalag during the Oblivion Crisis. He was not present at the Temple of the One when Martin shattered the Amulet of Kings and became Akatosh's avatar. Only the hero of Kvatch was there. Only the hero saw Martin transform. Dervanin, the NPC who gives you the quest in Skyrim, previously appeared as a priest of Mania in the Shivering Isles DLC. He is still serving the same master. The continuity is deliberate. Bethesda designed this reveal carefully. The philosophical question left open is whether the hero of Kvatch still exists inside Sheogorath. The Elder Scrolls concept of mantling, walking like a god until reality cannot distinguish the mortal from the deity, suggests a merger rather than replacement. Evidence for survival includes Sheogorath's personal memories of Oblivion and a subtle personality shift. Skyrim's Sheogorath is more whimsical than cruel. His quest involves curing madness, not causing it. Fans note this feels different from Oblivion's Sheogorath, who was vicious and calculating. Evidence for consumption. After 200 years, no trace of the original mortal personality emerges beyond fragmentary memories. Sheogorath refers to his mantle as passed down from me to myself, and he casually recounts events from eras before the hero hero of Kvatch was born, as if he experienced them personally. The mortal may have been devoured entirely by the role they assumed. Bethesda never directly confirmed Sheogorath in Skyrim is the hero of Kvatch to maintain their policy of ambiguity, but the in-game evidence is overwhelming and clearly intentional. The mortal became a god. Whether they survived that transformation or were consumed by it is the only mystery left. At least the hero of Kvatch's fate is known. The last Dragonborn's fate remains completely unresolved. The last Dragonborn. The last Dragonborn's fate is the great unresolved question hanging over Elder Scrolls lore, and TES 6 will almost certainly answer it. After defeating Alduin and Sovngarde, and notably Alduin's soul was never absorbed, meaning the World Eater may return at the true end of time, the Dragonborn traveled to Solstheim and killed Miraak, the first Dragonborn who had been trapped in Hermaeus Mora's realm of Apocrypha for 4,500 years. The Dragonborn DLC's ending is where everything turns ominous. As Miraak dies, Hermaeus Mora declares, "I have found a new Dragonborn to serve me." Later, when the Dragonborn returns to Apocrypha, Mora warns, "The lure of Apocrypha will call you back. It is your fate." Miraak's final words carry a bitter edge. "May he be rewarded for his service as I am." Parallel is unmistakable. Miraak spent millennia as Mora's prisoner, and Mora just claimed a replacement. The community's most widely accepted theory is that Hermaeus Mora will eventually trap the Dragonborn exactly as he trapped Miraak. The Dragonborn DLC becomes the character's last canonical act before being pulled into Apocrypha permanently. The parallel to the hero of Kvatch becoming Sheogorath after the Shivering Isles. DLC reinforces this reading. Final DLC equals final transformation. Pattern established. But the counter-arguments are substantial. The Dragonborn possesses a dragon soul, not a mortal soul that can be bargained away to Daedric princes, a shard of Akatosh himself. Hermaeus Mora never actually possessed Miraak's dragon soul. He trapped Miraak's body in Apocrypha and used his knowledge, but the dragon soul remained beyond his reach. When the last Dragonborn kills Miraak, they absorb his soul. Mora does not. That matters. And the Greybeards bestowed a title on the Dragonborn that carries immense weight, Ysmir, Dragon of the North. That is the exact same title held by Tiber Septim before he ascended to godhood and became Talos. The ghost of old Hroldan in Skyrim mistakes the Dragonborn for Hjalti, Tiber Septim's birth name. The game is drawing deliberate parallels between the last Dragonborn and the mortal who became a god. This fuels the second major theory, apotheosis. The Dragonborn absorbs dragon souls throughout the entire game. Each one is a fragment of Akka, the oversoul of the Time Dragon. By the end of the main quest, the Dragonborn has consumed dozens of these divine fragments. Then they kill Miraak and absorb his soul, which itself contains thousands of years of accumulated dragon souls from his time in Apocrypha. That is an unprecedented level of divine power stacking inside one mortal body. Community lore scholars on r/Teslore call this the third walking way to godhood, soul stack, combined with the Ysmir title, the Talos parallels, and the Shezarene theory that Elder Scrolls protagonists are avatars of Lorkhan, the missing god. Some believe the Dragonborn will mantle Talos, or merge with the Talos oversoul entirely, becoming a god not through Daedric transformation like the hero of Kvatch, but through Aedric ascension like Tiber Septim. Todd Howard has shared exactly zero details about the Dragonborn's fate or TES 6's plot. He confirmed in 2025 that the game is progressing very well, but offered nothing else. Bethesda's established pattern makes one thing certain: TES 6 will reference the last Dragonborn. Every game mentions the previous protagonist through books, rumors, or NPC dialogue. The most likely outcome, following precedent, is that the Dragonborn disappeared into Apocrypha, into divinity, into legend, but the game will tell us which. The Dragonborn stands at a crossroads between damnation and godhood, claimed by a Daedric prince, empowered by an Aedric gift, the only protagonist whose fate is genuinely open and awaiting resolution in the next game. But if you think the last Dragonborn story is complicated, wait until you hear about the hero who saved the world 6 times and was forgotten by history entirely. The Vestige. The Vestige occupies the strangest position of any Elder Scrolls protagonist. They are almost certainly the most powerful hero in the entire series. They have the longest list of accomplishments. They are functionally immortal, and they were completely erased from history. In 2E582, a mortal was sacrificed to Molag Bal by the Worm Cult. Their soul was ripped out, their body was killed, but their soul reformed in Coldharbour using Azure Plasm, the Daedric material native to Molag Bal's realm, creating a perfect, indestructible new body. The in-game book Chaotic Creatia, the Azure Plasm explains explains the mechanism. When Mundus faces existential threat, the heart of Nirn spontaneously generates Paragon Soul Shriven to defend itself, in a manner analogous to the way the mortal body fights off infection. The vestige is Nirn's immune response made flesh. This grants the vestige functional immortality. When killed, their azure plasm body reforms at way shrines, reattuned to Nirn through sky shards, which are fragments of Aetherius. Even after recovering their soul from Molag Bal during the main quest's climax, the vestige's original mortal body is long dead. They persist as a mortal soul inside an imperishable body made of Daedric material, a unique ontological status, neither fully mortal nor fully Daedric. The vestige's accomplishments are staggering and still growing. They have personally defeated or thwarted Molag Bal, Clavicus Vile, Mephala, Nocturnal, and Mehrunes Dagon. In the 2024 Gold Road expansion, they help exile Athelia, a forgotten Daedric prince of paths, to a reality without magic. And when Hermaeus Mora erased all memory of Athelia from existence itself, he exempted exactly two beings, himself and the vestige. The vestige now carries knowledge that no other creature in all of Mundus or Oblivion possesses. Mora designated them Fate's proxy and acknowledged their unique mortal ability to reach outcomes that would otherwise be impossible, a quality not possessed by immortal beings. The vestige has saved Tamriel at least 6 times across ESO's main quest and chapter storylines. They stopped the plane melt. They defeated the Daedric Triad. They ended the machinations of multiple Daedric princes. They are the single most accomplished hero in Elder Scrolls history by sheer volume of world-ending threats prevented. Yet no single-player Elder Scrolls game ever mentions them. Not Arena, not Daggerfall, not Morrowind, not Oblivion, not Skyrim. The vestige does not appear in any book, any dialogue, any rumor, or any prophecy in any mainline game. They are completely absent from the historical record. ESO creative director Rich Lambert explained the deliberate design logic behind this. Todd Howard and Matt Firor specifically chose the Second Era's Interregnum, a 400-year period of chaos where practically no records survive, so the MMO could exist without contradicting established lore. 1,000 years separate the Vestige's era from Arena's events. That is enough time for even the greatest deeds to be forgotten. Only immortal beings like Daedric princes would remember, and they are not writing history books for mortals. There is one curious footnote. In Arena and Daggerfall, Dunmer NPCs sometimes exclaimed by the Soulless One. This dialogue predates ESO by 2 decades, and is almost certainly coincidental, but the UESP notes dryly this may be coincidence. Since ESO continues receiving new content, the Seasons of the Wormcult arc launched in 2025, the Vestige's story has no definitive ending. Their fate remains perpetually unresolved. An immortal hero with an indestructible body, accumulating world-saving accomplishments endlessly in an era the future will never remember. The most powerful protagonist in Elder Scrolls history, condemned to be the most thorough footnote. The pattern across all 6 heroes is unmistakable. Saving Tamriel is not a career, it is a transformation. The Eternal Champion was forgotten. The Agent was erased by time. The Nerevarine chose exile and immortality. The hero of Kvatch became a mad god. The last Dragonborn stands claimed by forces beyond mortality, and the vestige persists forever in an era history will not record. None of them retire. They transcend, they vanish, or they become something else entirely, and the world moves on without them. The 8 Divines aren't just statues you walk past to grab a buff. They're the gods who literally killed themselves to build the world you're standing in, and each one of them has a story weirder, darker, and more complicated than the game ever bothers to tell you. So today, I'm breaking down every single Divine in Skyrim and everything we know about them, starting with the one who invented time itself, Akatosh. Akatosh is the dragon god of time, not a dragon who happens to be associated with time. He is time. Before Akatosh emerged after the creation of Mundus, time literally did not exist. No before, no after, no sequence of events, just an infinite, static nothing. His very crystallization into being is what kicked the clock on and started reality moving forward. Every single moment you've ever experienced in the Elder Scrolls universe exists because this one entity decided to show up. That alone would make him the most important divine in the Pantheon. But here's where it gets complicated. The Empire worships Akatosh as their chief deity. His sphere encompasses endurance, invincibility, and everlasting legitimacy. That last one is the important bit. The The entire political authority of the empire rests on the idea that Akatosh personally endorses their right to rule. Every emperor, every legion, every territorial claim traces its divine mandate back to the dragon god of time. He's not just a religious figure, he's the theological foundation of imperial power across all of Tamriel. But ask a traditional Nord about Akatosh, and you'll get a very different answer. To the old Nordic religion, the dragon god isn't some benevolent protector of civilization. He's Alduin, the World Eater, a cyclical force of apocalyptic destruction whose entire purpose is to devour the world at the end of every era so it can be reborn. The same deity the Empire parades around as their cosmic stamp of approval. The Nords, historically viewed as the literal end of everything, which is, not ideal for Imperial PR. And it gets weirder. The Aldmer call him Auriel, the Khajiit call him Alkosh. Every culture across Tamriel has a different name, and none of them fully agree on what he actually is. Some scholars propose that the original dragon god, known simply as Akka, was shattered into multiple aspects through dragon breaks, particularly the Middle Dawn. Under this theory, Akatosh, Alduin, and every dragon you fight in Skyrim are all fragments of one incomprehensibly powerful entity that got broken apart when time itself fractured. The dragon cult of ancient Skyrim understood this. They recognized that dragons carried a piece of Akatosh's sovereignty, which is exactly why they elevated dragons to divine rulers. But then the Dragon War happened. The dragons were eradicated, and post-war Nords increasingly adopted the imperial view that Akatosh and Alduin are completely separate beings, a convenient theological pivot that just so happened to align with imperial political interests. So, is Akatosh the benevolent father of time who legitimizes empires? Or is he a fractured piece of a shattered god whose other half wants to eat the universe? Nobody knows for certain, and that ambiguity is exactly what makes him the most fascinating divine in the entire pantheon. But if a god with an identity crisis sounds unsettling, wait until you hear about the divine, who might not have been a god at all, Arkay. Arkay is the god of the cycle of birth and death. And I want to stress the word cycle here, because most people hear god of death and immediately picture some grim reaper figure lurking in a crypt somewhere. That's not what Arkay is. His domain covers the entire loop: birth, life, death, rebirth, the changing of the seasons. He's less angel of death and more cosmic quality control for the entire circle of existence. But here's where Arkay gets genuinely interesting, and it starts with his origin story, because nobody can agree on where he actually came from. The first version says Arkay was a mortal shopkeeper, just some guy running a store. One day he stumbles across an ancient, untranslated manuscript and becomes completely consumed by it. He stops eating, stops sleeping, stops doing basically anything a functioning human being should do. He dedicates every waking moment to deciphering this text, which apparently contained the fundamental secrets of life and death. And the cruel irony is that he only understood what it was telling him after he'd already contracted plague from neglecting his own body. He was literally dying because he spent too long reading about dying. So there he is, on his deathbed, finally grasping the deepest truths of existence. And he prays to Mara for more time. Mara shows up and gives him the most insane binary choice in Elder Scrolls history: die right now, or become a god for eternity. Hey, quick question before you go. Do you want to be immortal? No pressure. He picked the god option, obviously. But then there's the second origin story from the Monomyth, which says Arkay was never mortal at all. According to this version, he was among the very first spirits to crystallize after time began, making him one of the most primordial Aedric entities in existence. Not a shopkeeper who got lucky. A fundamental force of the universe from day one. Nobody knows which version is true. His own priesthood can't agree. Now, the practical side. His priests are the most aggressively anti-necromancy faction you'll find outside of the vigilance of Stendarr. Raising the dead isn't just frowned upon. It's the single worst thing you can do, a direct violation of the natural order that Arkay exists to protect. And his divine law backs this up with something tangible. Bodies that receive proper burial rites are said to be protected from necromantic animation. Skip the funeral, and that corpse is fair game for any necromancer who wanders by. His primary center of worship in Skyrim sits in Falkreath Hold, which makes perfect sense. Falkreath is basically defined by its massive graveyard. The whole town revolves around death and remembrance. If Arkay was going to set up shop anywhere, it was always going to be there. And here's one last thing that keeps the community arguing. Some fan theorists believe Arkay might actually be more powerful than Akatosh. The logic goes like this. Akatosh controls time, sure, but even time has to end eventually. Everything terminates in death, and death is Arkay's domain. If the god of time is ultimately subject to the god of death's jurisdiction, then who's really running the show? It's a bold claim, but nobody's been able to fully shut it down either. But if you think a god with two contradictory origin stories and a claim to supreme cosmic power is complicated, wait until you meet the divine whose entire theology revolves around beauty, love, and having zero restrictions on your romantic life. Dibella. Dibella has a reputation. And look, it's not entirely undeserved. Her commandment literally states that there should be no limit on the number of lovers a person might take. That's an actual divine teaching, written down, officially endorsed by a god, carved into the theological bedrock of Tamriel. So yeah, she gets a certain kind of attention from the community. But here's the thing, Dibella is actually one of the most genuinely wholesome deities in the entire Elder Scrolls universe, and it's not even close. Her core teachings emphasize friendship, harmony, and kindness above everything else. She's described as one of the truly pure gods, whose intentions remain wholly benevolent. Zero ulterior motives, zero moral gray areas, zero, well, technically she did flood a city that one time footnotes. She just wants people to appreciate beauty, create art, love each other, and stop being miserable about it. The unlimited lovers thing is really just one bullet point on a much longer list of celebrating life without restriction. But naturally, that's the one everyone remembers. Her origin story is as noble as it gets. Dibella emerged from the primordial merging of Anu and Padme alongside the other Idra, and then sacrificed herself to help create the mortal realm. That's the same creation myth as Akatosh and Arkay. She gave up her divine immortality so that mortals could exist and experience the beauty she embodies. And unlike some of the other divines who have complicated histories or the occasional apocalyptic alter ego, Dibella's track record is completely spotless. She is the goddess equivalent of that friend who brings homemade cookies to every gathering, and genuinely means it every single time. Now, her role as patroness of artistic creation is where things get genuinely wild. There's an artifact called the Brush of True Paint that was allegedly woven from Dibella's own hair. And this isn't just some enchanted paintbrush that makes your landscapes look a bit nicer. It literally opens a portal into the canvas itself, allowing the artist to physically step inside and paint at life size. You're not painting a world on a flat surface. You're building one from the inside. That's the kind of power Dibella represents, and honestly, it might be one of the most absurd artifact concepts in the entire franchise. Most divine artifacts give you a cool sword. Dibella's gives you a pocket dimension made of paint. Her worship in Skyrim centers around the Temple of Dibella in Markarth, where her priestesses maintain something called the Exalted Protocol. It's a mysterious ceremony through which Dibella transmits her divine will through a designated messenger known as a Sibyl. The specifics are kept deliberately vague, which only makes the whole thing more fascinating. Most divines just sit on their cosmic thrones and let mortals sort things out. Dibella is actively sending messages through a chosen vessel. She's engaged, she's got a whole communication infrastructure. And then there's the anti-vampire clause, which is genuinely entertaining. Dibella explicitly discourages relations with the undead in any form. Vampires, Draugr, any of it. Her teachings are entirely life-affirming, and anything that's technically dead is completely off the table. So if you were wondering whether the goddess of unlimited love draws the line anywhere, yes, she draws it at corpses, which is, a fair boundary to establish. But if Dibella represents the beauty and passion of mortal experience, the next divine on our list couldn't be more different. He doesn't care about your feeling. He cares about logic. Julianos. Julianos is the god of wisdom, logic, and magic. And honestly, he might be the most underappreciated divine in the entire pantheon. His domain covers literature, law, history, and here's the interesting part, the resolution of contradictions through reason. That's his actual job. When two things in the universe don't make sense together, Julianos is the divine principle that sorts it out. Which is, not ideal when you realize how many contradictions exist in Tamriel. But here's where it gets really interesting. Julianos doesn't treat magic the way most people think about it. Sorcery, alchemy, enchantment, all of these fall under his domain, but not as mystical arts. He treats them as branches of rigorous intellectual discipline. Magic, in the eyes of Julianos, is basically applied mathematics. You don't pray your way into a fireball. You study your way into one. His temples function as educational institutions rather than spiritual retreats, and they're historically responsible for spreading the formal term magicka throughout Tamriel. Before his priesthood standardized the language, people were just calling it whatever they wanted. Julianos literally gave the world a vocabulary for magic. His Nordic roots trace back to Junal, the father of language and mathematics. But here's the thing. Junal fell out of favor among the Nords over time. A culture that prizes axes and mead over textbooks and equations gradually stopped caring about the god of homework. So Julianos became more of a Cyrodiilic institution, which is a shame, because his influence runs deeper than most people realize. Tiber Septim himself founded monastic orders specifically dedicated to Julianos. Their purpose? To serve as keepers of the Elder Scrolls themselves, the single most powerful prophetic artifacts in all of existence. The scrolls that literally blind you if you read them wrong, and Julianos is their divine guardian. That's not a minor portfolio. That's custody of fate itself. His followers live by a simple creed: know the truth, observe the law, awe, and when you don't know something, seek wisdom from the wise. Straightforward, almost suspiciously reasonable for a fantasy religion. Now, nobody talks about this, but the contrast between Julianos and Hermaeus Mora is fascinating. Both claim dominion over knowledge, but Julianos represents accessible, organized, shareable knowledge, libraries, schools, public education. Hermaeus Mora hoards forbidden secrets in a nightmare dimension made of tentacles and screaming books. One builds universities, the other builds traps. Julianos is the Wikipedia of the divines. Hermaeus Mora is the dark web, and here's the detail that ties everything together. Julianos is explicitly named after Julian Leifve, one of the original designers of the Elder Scrolls series. His role as the keeper of knowledge and the resolver of contradictions intentionally mirrors what a game designer actually does, maintaining the structural integrity of an entire fictional universe. Every time the lore contradicts itself, every time a timeline doesn't add up, that's a Julianos problem. The developers literally built themselves into the pantheon as the god responsible for making sure everything makes sense. That is genuinely brilliant world-building self-awareness, and the fact that almost nobody talks about it is criminal. Despite all of this cosmic importance, Julianos barely gets a mention in Skyrim. You can find his shrine in the Temple of the Divines in Solitude, and that's about it. No quests, no major storylines. The god responsible for guarding the Elder Scrolls in a game called The Elder Scrolls, and he's basically furniture. I don't know what to tell you. But if Julianos represents the invisible intellectual architecture holding everything together, the next divine represents something you can actually feel on your skin every single second you spend in Skyrim. Kynareth. Kynareth is the goddess of the heavens, winds, elements, and unseen spirits of the air. She is, by all accounts, the strongest of the sky spirits, patron deity of sailors and travelers, the divine responsible for every breath you take and every gust of wind that fills a sail or freezes your face off on the throat of the world. But here's what makes Kynareth genuinely fascinating. She may have been the first deity to agree to the plan for creating the mortal plane. Not Akatosh, not Mara, Kynareth. She looked at the blueprint for Mundus and said, yeah, let's do it, then provided the fundamental space and atmospheric conditions necessary for existence to even happen. Without her, there's no sky, there's no air, there's no space for anything to exist in. Every other divine could have shown up with their contributions and it wouldn't have mattered, because there'd be nowhere to put any of it. And yet, most players walk right past her shrine without a second thought. The naming situation with Kynareth tells you everything about the theological tension running through Skyrim. The Imperials call her Kynareth. Clean, formal, sounds like something you'd read in a government pamphlet. But the traditional Nords, they call her Kyne. The Khajiit know her as Kynarthi. The Redguards call her Tava. Same goddess, completely different relationships. And the Kyne version is the one that matters most in Skyrim, because that's where her worship gets personal. Traditional Nordic hunters don't just acknowledge her, they invoke her as the Mother of Men, the Mother of Nords. She's not some distant cosmic force to them, she's family. Now here's where it gets genuinely poetic, and honestly, a little haunting. The Nords believe that Kyne is the one who leads fallen souls to Sovngarde. This earned her the title Kiss at the End. Think about that for a second. The same goddess whose breath fills your lungs the moment you're born is the last thing you feel when you die. She sustains your life for every single second you're alive. And then, when it's over, she gently guides you to the Nordic afterlife. She is literally the first and last divine force you ever experience, which is, you know, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Her presence in Skyrim reflects this dual nature in a quietly understated way. If you climb the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar, you'll find shrines to Kyne along the path. Simple stone altars with etched plaques and lit braziers standing against the open sky. No grand statues, no elaborate iconography, just stone, fire, and wind. There's something fitting about that. The goddess of the air doesn't need a cathedral. She is the cathedral. Every frozen gust that nearly knocks you off the mountainside on your way up is her reminding you she's there. It's a surprisingly elegant piece of design for a game that also lets you put a bucket on a shopkeeper's head and rob them blind. Kynareth also maintains a complementary relationship with Zenithar that most people overlook entirely. She provides the raw materials of creation, the wind, the rain, the natural resources that exist, because she made the sky and the elements possible. Zenithar then takes those raw materials and facilitates their transformation into crafted goods through human labor. She gives, he builds. It's a divine supply chain, and without Kynareth's end of it, Zenithar's entire domain collapses. No raw materials, no commerce, no sky, no civilization. She's the foundation that everyone else builds on top of and nobody thinks to thank. The widow of Shor, the breath in your chest, the kiss when it stops, Kinnereth is quietly one of the most important divines in the entire pantheon, and the fact that she doesn't get more attention is honestly criminal. But if Kinnereth is the divine who sustains life and guides you gently into death, the next goddess takes a completely different approach to what makes existence worth living in the first place. Mara. If you've ever played Skyrim for more than a few hours, you've interacted with Mara's domain whether you realized it or not. That amulet of Mara sitting in your inventory? The one you bought from Marimal and the Bee and Barb because you wanted to marry Lydia or whoever caught your eye? That's not just a game mechanic. That's a literal divine prerequisite. Without Mara's blessing, no marriage in Skyrim is considered legitimate. You can be the Dragonborn, Thane of every hold, Slayer of Alduin himself, and you still can't put a ring on it without buying a necklace from a priest first. Mara is the goddess of love, fertility, compassion, and agriculture. She's known as Mother Mara, or Mother Mile, and her commandment instructs the faithful to live soberly and peacefully, honor their parents, and preserve the peace and security of the home and family. On paper, that sounds like the most boring divine in the entire pantheon. In practice, she's the one holding civilization together with both hands. Here's the thing about Mara that most people overlook. Her priesthood doesn't care who you want to marry. Man, woman, Argonian, orc, dark elf, doesn't matter. Mara's temples will perform the ceremony regardless of gender or race, because her teaching is explicit. Those distinctions mean nothing to the divine principle of love. For a fantasy medieval setting, that's a quietly radical theological stance. Most religions in these worlds are busy condemning people for looking at the wrong deity sideways, and Mara's priests are just out here like, you two love each other? Cool, Wednesday works for us. But Mara isn't just the wedding planner of the divines. Her mythological significance runs far deeper than most players realize. In the earliest moments of creation, the original spirits, known as the Errata, sacrificed parts of themselves to form the mortal plane. Mara was among those who gave of herself during this process, pouring her essence into the very fabric of Nirn. That means the world you're walking around in, every blade of grass in the rift, every hearth fire keeping a family warm, exists in part because Mara bled for it. Every time you stop to appreciate something peaceful in Tamriel, you're standing on a piece of her sacrifice. And remember, Arkay, the god of life and death we talked about earlier? Turns out Mara is directly responsible for his existence as a divine. According to one of the most widely accepted origin stories, Arkay was originally a mortal man, a shopkeeper obsessed with deciphering an ancient text about the secrets of life and death. He spent so long studying it that he neglected everything else, and by the time he finally understood what the manuscript was telling him, he was already dying of plague. At the threshold of death, it was Mara who appeared and offered him the choice: die now as a mortal or become a god for eternity, charged with keeping the balance between life and death in the universe. Arkay chose divinity. So the god who governs every funeral rite and protects every corpse from necromantic violation only exists because Mara decided he was worthy. That's not a minor footnote. That's one divine literally creating another. Scholars have also drawn parallels between Mara and Mary from Christian tradition, noting the shared emphasis on maternal love, compassion, and the feminine divine principle. The name's similarity alone is hard to ignore, and the theological overlap. A mother figure who embodies unconditional love and serves as the emotional anchor of an entire belief system feels too precise to be coincidental. What makes Mara genuinely compelling is that she represents something most divine pantheons treat as an afterthought: love, family, the quiet act of raising children and keeping a home safe. These aren't dramatic. They don't make for epic battles or world-ending prophecies. But without them, nothing else in Tamriel functions. No armies march without families to protect. No cities thrive without communities bound together by something stronger than commerce or law. Mara understood that before anyone else did. But if Mara represents the gentle bonds that hold society together, the next divine represents what happens when those bonds need enforcing. Stendarr. Stendarr's very title tells you everything you need to know about why he's one of the most philosophically loaded divines in the entire pantheon. He's the god of righteous might and merciful forbearance. Read that again. Righteous might, merciful forbearance. Those two concepts are in a constant tug of war with each other, and his entire theology is built around the tension between them. Here's the thing. Most gods of strength in fantasy settings are pretty straightforward. They hit things. They encourage you to hit things. Maybe they reward you for hitting things especially hard. Stendarr isn't that. Stendarr is the god who says, yes, you absolutely have the power to crush your enemy. But the real question is whether you should. His domain represents the principle that true strength expresses itself through restraint and fairness, rather than unbridled domination. He's not anti-violence, he's anti-pointless violence. There's a difference, and that difference is basically his entire religion. In practice, this makes him the patron of magistrates, rulers, and every citizen across Tamriel who believes in fair governance. He's the divine backbone of the justice system. Every judge who passes a fair sentence, every soldier who protects civilians instead of looting them, every ruler who chooses diplomacy before drawing a sword, they're all operating within Stendarr's sphere whether they know it or not. He's the god of doing the right thing when doing the wrong thing would be way easier and probably more fun. But here's where it gets fascinating. Stendarr doesn't just passively embody justice. He's specifically regarded as the god of compassion and righteous rule over mortals. In a pantheon full of gods who sacrificed themselves to create the world and arguably got a raw deal out of it, Stendarr is the one whose sphere explicitly includes mercy toward the people living in it. He positioned himself as the intersection between divine authority and mortal welfare, essentially the god who insists that power comes with obligation. This philosophy gets even more interesting when you consider his connection to governance across Tamriel. Stendarr's teachings form the moral bedrock of imperial law and order. Whether the Empire always lived up to those ideals is another question entirely, but the framework was there. His principles were baked into the institutions that held Tamriel together for centuries. A god of justice and mercy underpinning the legal philosophy of an entire continent is either the strongest endorsement of structured governance in Elder Scrolls history or the most ambitious moral experiment ever attempted, possibly both. Now, gameplay-wise, his blessing grants block more effectively against incoming attacks. On the surface, that sounds like a nice little perk, but theologically, it makes perfect sense. Stendarr's entire philosophy is about measured defense, not reckless offense. His blessing doesn't make you hit harder. It makes you better at absorbing what the world throws at you. Protection, not aggression. Even his gameplay mechanic reinforces his philosophy, and that distinction matters more than most players realize. Any warlord can swing a mace. Any tyrant can crush opposition through brute force. Stendarr asks a harder question. Is the force you're deploying just? Are you fighting to protect, or are you fighting to conquer? Are you a shield or a battering ram? His theology doesn't reject violence. It demands that violence answer to something higher than personal glory or territorial ambition. The vigilance of Stendarr, his most devoted followers in Skyrim, embody this philosophy by actively hunting Daedra worshippers and undead threats across the province. They're not pacifists. They're warriors with a moral framework. They'll absolutely destroy a vampire, but they'll do it because vampires represent a violation of natural law, not because they enjoy it, at least in theory. But if Stendarr represents the moral backbone of how civilizations should govern and fight, the next divine represents something equally foundational but far less dramatic: how civilizations actually pay for everything. Zenithar. In a pantheon full of cosmic dragons, death gods, and sky mothers, Zenithar is the divine who looked at a blacksmith hammering at an anvil and said, "That's sacred." And honestly, he might be the most quietly profound god in the entire Elder Scrolls universe. Zenithar is the god of trade, commerce, work, and craftsmanship. His whole theological framework boils down to one deceptively simple idea. The spiritual benefit of labor isn't the money you make. It's the honest engagement with productive activity itself. The work is the point, not the paycheck, which, coming from a god whose followers are literally merchants, is a surprisingly philosophical stance. His followers are taught to work hard, spend wisely, never steal, and never scam. That's it. That's the moral code. No cosmic riddles, no apocalyptic prophecies. Just be honest, make things, and don't rip people off. Traders across Tamriel carry amulets of Zenithar for luck in their financial dealings, and his primary symbol is the anvil. Not a sword, not a scroll, the tool you use to make other tools. Here's where it gets interesting. His chapels and shrines don't just function as places of worship. They actively serve as gathering points for merchants and tradespeople, places where commerce and faith are literally the same activity. His priests aren't just leading prayers. They're blessing transactions, sanctifying labor, making sure the divine stamp of approval sits on honest work, which is, not exactly the glamorous side of godhood, but arguably more useful than half the cosmic nonsense the other divines get up to. Now, his creation story is where things get genuinely beautiful. Zenithar participated in the craft of creating Mundus alongside the other divine artisans. Then, like all the Aedra, he was bound to the Earth's bones. His origin story literally frames the creation of reality as a craft project. The universe wasn't willed into existence by pure cosmic power. It was built, assembled, worked on. Zenithar's entire existence argues that creation and craftsmanship are the same thing, and he doesn't work alone. Zenithar maintains a relationship with Kynareth that's one of the most elegant pieces of theology in the whole franchise. Kynareth provides the raw materials of creation creation, the wind, the sky, the natural world. Zenithar facilitates their transformation through human labor and commerce. She grows the trees, he builds the houses. It's a divine supply chain, and it frames the relationship between nature and civilization as collaboration rather than conflict. His association with the Bosmeri god Xin suggests deep continuities between imperial and elven religious traditions, meaning the concept of sacred labor predates the empire itself. Elves were venerating honest work long before Tiber Septim showed up and started renaming everybody's gods. But here's the detail that stuck with me the most. Some fan theorists have drawn uncomfortable parallels between Zenithar and Clavicus Vile. Both gods deal in transaction and exchange. Both operate in the space where two parties agree to a deal. The difference is everything. Zenithar demands honesty, fair prices, mutual benefit. Clavicus Vile exploits the fine print, twists the wording, and makes sure you lose everything while technically getting what you asked for. Same mechanism, opposite morality. One represents commerce as shared prosperity, the other represents commerce as a weapon, and that's what makes Zenithar quietly the most important divine in the pantheon. Akatosh governs time, Arkay governs death, Kinnereth governs the sky, but Zenithar governs the thing most people actually spend their lives doing: working, building, trading. He's the god who says a carpenter sanding a table is performing an act just as sacred as a priest praying at an altar. That meaning isn't found in some grand cosmic revelation. It's found in honest work, done well for fair compensation. In a world full of Daedric princes offering power through corruption and Adric gods demanding devotion through suffering, Zenithar just asks you to do your job and not be a jerk about it. And somehow, that's the most radical theology in all of Tamriel. The Elder Scrolls has dozens of factions, from ancient magical orders to underground assassin cults to full-blown continental armies. Some have been around for thousands of years. Some barely survived a single era. Today, I'm breaking down every major faction in the series, what they stand for, how they rose, and why most of them fell apart, starting with the one faction that just wanted to hit things for money: the Fighters Guild. In a world full of Daedric conspiracies, necromancer cults, and elves trying to unmake reality itself, the Fighters Guild is refreshingly simple. No gods, no ancient prophecies, just regular people swinging swords at other people's problems for coin. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. The guild was founded during the Second Era to consolidate Tamriel's scattered mercenaries into one professional organization with standardized contracts and a ranking system. Before it existed, hiring a sellsword was basically a coin flip between getting a competent warrior and getting some guy named Grelid who'd rob you the second you turned around. The guild fixed that by creating accountability and a reputation worth protecting. Here's what made the Fighters Guild genuinely unique. It was completely meritocratic. Any citizen could join regardless of birth, bloodline, race, or social standing. You didn't need noble heritage or magical talent. You needed a weapon and the willingness to use it. Kill the rats, clear the cave, escort the merchant, move up a rank. Simple. By the Third Era, the guild had permanent halls in most major cities across every imperial province, offering training, lodging, equipment, and a genuine career path. One of the most accessible institutions in the entire empire, which is remarkable, considering most organizations in Tamriel require you to either be born into the right family or sell your soul to something with too many eyes. And then, the Blackwood Company showed up. During the events of Oblivion, this rival mercenary outfit started aggressively undercutting the Fighters Guild on contracts across Cyrodiil. Worse, their secret weapon was hissed sap, a substance they were feeding to operatives that sent them into uncontrollable berserker rages. Their mercenaries were literally drugged out of their minds, massacring civilians on jobs and not even remembering it afterward. The guild had to infiltrate the Blackwood Company, expose the operation, and destroy their heist tree to shut the whole thing down. The most straightforward faction in Tamriel nearly got run out of business by a bunch of juiced-up psychopaths who couldn't tell a bandit from a farmer. The guild survived, but after the Oblivion Crisis, the organization hemorrhaged influence to military institutions more tightly aligned with the Empire's restructured power apparatus. Turns out, when the world nearly ends, governments prefer giving contracts to organizations they directly control rather than independent guilds that just spent the last year getting outcompeted by drug-fueled maniacs, which is, fair. The Fighters Guild's collapse is basically the most relatable institutional failure in Elder Scrolls history. No cosmic betrayal, no Daedric interference. Just a rival company undercutting them and a changing market that left them behind. If that doesn't sound like every mid-sized business that's ever existed, I don't know what does. But if the Fighters Guild's downfall was painfully mundane, the Mages Guild managed to implode in a way that was significantly more dramatic and involved a lot more necromancy. The Mages Guild. Vanus Galerion is one of the most important figures in Elder Scrolls history, and nobody gives him enough credit. This is a guy who was trained by the Psijic Order, the most exclusive and secretive magical organization on the entire continent, and his response was to look around at all that hoarded knowledge and say, yeah, no, everyone should have this. In 2E230, Galerion founded the Mages Guild as a direct challenge to the Psijic Order's monopoly on magical education. His charter proposed something genuinely radical. Any citizen of Tamriel who could afford the fees could learn magic. Not just high elves, not just nobility, anyone. This was the magical equivalent of inventing the public library, and the established hierarchy absolutely hated it. Getting the charter approved required sign-off from both the Psijic leadership and King Rylus XII of Firsthold. The fact that it passed at all is kind of a miracle, and the guild he built wasn't some loose collection of wizards sharing notes. A supreme council of 6 archmages oversaw regional masters and local chapter leaders across the entire continent. The Arcane University in the Imperial City became the crown jewel of the operation, basically the Harvard of blowing things up with your mind. At its peak, the Mages Guild had chapters in virtually every major city in Tamriel. But here's where it gets complicated. The necromancy question haunted this guild from the beginning. When you tell everyone they can learn magic, eventually someone's going to ask about the really dangerous stuff. Enter Mannimarco, the king of worms, who wasn't just practicing necromancy in some basement. He was building an entire rival organization dedicated to raising the dead and harvesting souls. Galerion committed everything to stopping him. The final battle ended with Galerion sacrificing his own life to defeat the necromancer's forces. The founder of the Mages Guild died fighting the exact kind of magical corruption his institution was supposed to prevent, which is, not ideal. And here's the kicker. Even after Galerion's sacrifice, the necromancy debate never went away. It just festered inside the guild like an infection for centuries, with factions arguing endlessly about where to draw the line on forbidden knowledge. Then, the Oblivion Crisis happened, and everything fell apart. After Daedric gates started opening across Tamriel and demons poured into every major city, public opinion turned violently against mages. People didn't care about the distinction between a guild wizard selling healing potions and a necromancer raising corpses. Magic was magic, and magic had just nearly destroyed the world. The guild fractured into 2 successor organizations. The Synod, which took a hard conservative stance and tried to play nice with the Empire, and the College of Whispers, which maintained a much more permissive attitude toward forbidden arts. Neither came close to achieving the unified authority of the original Mages Guild. Galerion built an institution that spanned the known world, and within a few centuries of his death, it split in half over the exact question he tried to answer. Who gets to use dangerous knowledge? Turns out, nobody agreed on the answer. But if the Mages Guild tore itself apart over philosophy, wait until you hear about the faction that turned crime itself into an art form. The Thieves Guild. Most factions in Tamriel claim to serve some noble purpose. The Thieves Guild doesn't bother. It exists to steal things, and it's somehow more functional than every legitimate institution on the continent. That's not a joke. An organization built entirely around crime developed a stricter ethical code than most governments, and it worked so well that every thief on Tamriel eventually copied it. Here's the thing. Before the guild existed, thieves were a mess. You had hundreds of independent criminals all working against each other, stealing from the same targets, undercutting each other's fences, and occasionally just killing each other over territory. Nobody was making real money. It was like watching a room full of people fight over crumbs while ignoring the entire bakery. Then someone had what might be the most productive idea any criminal has ever had. Organize the scattered thieves under a set of explicit rules. Never steal from a fellow member, never kill on the job, never steal from the poor. 3 rules. That's it. And overnight, theft went from chaotic individual crime to a coordinated profession with ethical standards that honestly put some merchant guilds to shame. But the real proof of concept came with how the guild embedded itself into legitimate power structures. This wasn't just pickpocketing and burglary. The guild built fence networks, bribed officials, and created an entire shadow economy that ran parallel to the real one. The aristocrats and merchant lords who controlled city economies eventually had to acknowledge that the guild was a force they couldn't just stamp out. They had to coexist. That's not theft. That's a hostile takeover with better peer. And the model spread everywhere. Nearly every Thieves Guild chapter across Tamriel traces its operational methods and philosophy back to those same core principles. The rules, the structure, the fence networks, all of it. Whoever set those original guidelines essentially franchised crime. Now, the system isn't foolproof. The Riften chapter in the 4th era proved that when their guildmaster, Mercer Frey, turned out to be the single worst leader in the guild's history, and the competition for that title is steep. Mercer murdered his predecessor, Gallus Desidenius. He stole the Skeleton Key, a Daedric artifact of immense power. He drained the guild treasury, and then, because apparently that wasn't enough, he framed an innocent member named Carlia for the whole thing. Hey, who robbed us blind and killed the boss? Definitely not me, the guy who is suspiciously wealthy all of a sudden. The guild nearly collapsed under his leadership. Contracts dried up, influence shrank, and members started wondering if maybe the organization was cursed. Which, not ideal for morale. But here's where it gets interesting. Once Mercer's betrayal was exposed and dealt with, the guild didn't just cover. It experienced a genuine renaissance. Influence expanded to cities as far away as Solitude, the treasury was restored, hard, and the guild's reputation came back stronger than before. The corruption arc mirrors what happened with the Fighters Guild, but the Thieves Guild version has higher stakes, a better villain, and an ending that actually feels earned. The whole thing proves a weirdly optimistic point. Crime absolutely can pay, as long as you organize it properly and don't let one guy with a Daedric artifact ruin everything. But if you think the Thieves Guild operates in moral gray areas, wait until you hear about the faction that threw morality out the window entirely, the Dark Brotherhood. Most factions in Tamriel at least pretend to have noble intentions. The Dark Brotherhood doesn't even bother. This is a murder cult that also happens to be a business, and somehow that's not even the weirdest part about them. The Brotherhood didn't appear out of thin air. It splintered off from the Morag Tong, Morrowind's legally sanctioned assassins guild. Yes, legally sanctioned. The Morag Tong operated with full government recognition, carrying out assassinations as a regulated public service, which is, not ideal, but at least there were rules. Problem was that the Morag Tong's influence started shrinking outside of Morrowind, and their rigid structure couldn't keep up with the growing demand for people who needed other people to stop being alive. So a splinter group broke away, and things got significantly darker. Here's where it gets weird. The Dark Brotherhood didn't just organize itself like a normal criminal enterprise. Sithis, a primordial force representing the void and chaos itself, allegedly manifested through a figure known as the Night Mother to establish the Brotherhood as an instrument of death and soul harvesting. The Night Mother is exactly what she sounds like: a corpse, a preserved ancient corpse kept in a coffin who whispers assassination contracts to a single chosen member called the Listener. The entire organization takes spiritual direction from a dead woman in a box. I don't know what to tell you. The genius of the Dark Brotherhood, if you can call it that, is how it merged religious fanaticism with cold commercial logic. Every kill was simultaneously a sacred offering to Sithis and a paid transaction. You didn't need political connections or noble blood to hire them, you just needed coin. A farmer who wanted his neighbor dead received the same professional courtesy as a noble plotting against a rival. Assassination is a fully democratized service. Sithis doesn't discriminate. The organization's leadership structure reflected this blend of mysticism and management. The Black Hand sat at the top, one listener, chosen directly by the Night Mother, and 4 speakers who each oversaw their own group of silencers and executioners. It's a corporate board where the CEO takes orders from a talking corpse and middle management carries out the wet work. Standard stuff. Now, the Brotherhood's most consequential operation was also its messiest. The attempted assassination of Emperor Titus Mede II initially failed. Dramatically, the Brotherhood's sanctuary was nearly destroyed. Its members were hunted and the whole thing looked like a catastrophic embarrassment. But the Night Mother, apparently unbothered by the setback, established a new contract through a man named Amand Motier. The Brotherhood regrouped, infiltrated the Emperor's personal vessel, the Kataria, and finished the job. The Emperor of Tamriel killed aboard his own ship, a botched operation that somehow became the single most consequential assassination in modern Tamriel history. Here's the thing though, despite pulling off the kind of contract that should have cemented the Brotherhood's legend for centuries, the organization never fully recovered. The Oblivion Crisis had already gutted their leadership when members of the Black Hand were systematically assassinated from within. The Brotherhood that killed Emperor Mede was a shadow of what it had been at its peak. Fewer sanctuaries, fewer members, operating out of crumbling hideouts instead of the sprawling underground networks they once maintained. They proved they could still kill an emperor, but they couldn't rebuild what they'd lost. The Dark Brotherhood is what happens when you take religion, capitalism, and murder and smash them together until they're indistinguishable, sacred and transactional, devout and mercenary, a dying organization that can still reach the most powerful man on the continent. That contradiction is what makes them one of the most fascinating factions in Elder Scrolls, and easily the most unsettling. But if a murder cult operating in the shadows sounds dangerous, wait until you hear about the faction that operated in plain sight, standing directly behind the Emperor with swords drawn. The Blades. The Blades have the single best origin story of any faction in Elder Scrolls. And it's not even close, because they didn't start as bodyguards, they didn't start as spies. They started as dragon hunters from another continent. Before the Blades ever set foot on Tamriel, they were the Dragon Guard, an ancient order operating in Akavir during the First Era. Their entire purpose was hunting and killing dragons in the dragon's own homeland. That was the job description. Find dragons, kill dragons, repeat. And they were exceptionally good at it. Then the Akaviri invaded Tamriel, and the Dragon Guard came with them. When Emperor Raymond ultimately repelled the invasion, the surviving Dragon Guard didn't just scatter or disappear. They underwent one of the most dramatic career changes in Tamriel's history. These specialized dragon-killing warriors looked around, realized the dragon population on Tamriel was basically zero, and pivoted hard. They transitioned from elite monster hunters into the Empire's covert military military force and secret service. Basically went from hunting the most dangerous creatures alive to becoming the ancient world's CIA. Here's where it gets really interesting. When Tiber Septim began his conquest of Tamriel in the late Second Era, the remnants of the Dragon Guard recognized him as Dragonborn. They emerged from relative obscurity, pledged their service, and under Septim, they officially became the Blades. Not just bodyguards, not just soldiers. They became the Emperor's personal guard, his elite military force, and his primary intelligence network, all rolled into one organization. Members operated across every province in Tamriel disguised as merchants, thieves, craftsmen, mages, and warriors. Your friendly neighborhood blacksmith could have been a Blades agent reporting directly to the Emperor. You'd never know. That was the point. For the entirety of the Third Era, the Blades operated as the most trusted organization in the Empire. Their loyalty wasn't to politics or policy. It was to the Dragonborn line itself. Every emperor in the Septim dynasty had the Blades watching their back, gathering intelligence, eliminating threats before they materialized. The organization had evolved so far from its origins that dragon slaying became a secondary footnote in their charter, something they technically still did, but almost never needed to. Then the Thalmor happened. During and after the Great War, the Aldmeri Dominion identified the Blades as one of the most dangerous threats to their plans for continental supremacy, and they weren't wrong. An intelligence network embedded in every province, loyal to the Empire above all else, operating with zero oversight? The Thalmor couldn't tolerate that, so they conducted targeted elimination operations, hunted Blades agents across Tamriel, killed them systematically. They even sent the severed heads of captured Blades agents to the Imperial City as a message, which is, not ideal. But the real killing blow wasn't a sword, it was a piece of paper. The White Gold Concordat of 4E175, the treaty that ended the Great War, included an explicit clause mandating the complete disbandment of the Blades. Centuries of service to the Dragonborn line, erased by a single line in a peace treaty. The empire they dedicated their existence to protecting signed them away as a bargaining chip. By 4E201, the Blades had gone from a continent-spanning intelligence apparatus with agents in every city to exactly 2 people. Delphine, running an inn in Riverwood under a fake identity. Esbern, hiding in the sewers of Riften, half convinced the Thalmor would find him any day. That's it. 2 survivors of an organization that once protected emperors and shaped the fate of nations, trying to recruit new members and rebuild from literally nothing. Dragon hunters who became spies, who became bodyguards, who became fugitives. If that's not the best faction arc in Elder Scrolls, I don't know what is. But if the Blades represent an organization destroyed by political forces beyond its control, the next faction represents something stranger, a group so powerful they simply chose to disappear. The Psijic Order. Every faction we've covered so far thinks they're old. The Psijic Order looks at all of them the way a grandparent looks at a toddler trying to eat a crayon. This is the single most ancient magical organization in Tamriel's history, and they've spent most of that history making sure you know absolutely nothing about them. The Order originated in the Somerset Isles as a gathering of Altmer elders who dedicated themselves to preserving what they called the old ways. And when they say old, they mean it. These weren't mages studying dusty textbooks. They were preserving magical traditions and philosophical frameworks that predated most of Tamriel's civilizations entirely. Their whole mission was to protect this knowledge from cultural corruption and moral decline, which, if you think about it, is a polite way of saying they looked at the rest of the world and decided it wasn't good enough. Here's the thing. The Psijic Order didn't just gatekeep knowledge casually. They turned exclusivity into an art form. Rite Master Iakesis presided over the Order for over 3,000 years. 3,000. Most empires don't last 300, and during roughly 1,000 years of that tenure, the Order admitted exactly 17 new members. 17. That's not a faction. That's a dinner party. You have a better chance of getting struck by lightning while riding a horse backward than you do of getting a Psijic invitation, but their contributions to magical theory were enormous, even if they'd never admit it publicly. The Psijic Order is indirectly responsible for developing mysticism as an entire school of magic. They created the Cloven Duality, a philosophical framework exploring the relationship between order and chaos in magical theory, and they allegedly developed something called the Calling, a form of telepathic communication that allowed members to contact each other across vast distances without any conventional magical apparatus. Just thinking at someone really hard, except it actually worked. They also took a hard stance on necromancy, outlawing it completely among their members. This wasn't just a policy preference. For the Altmer, ancestor spirits hold deep cultural and religious significance. Raising the dead wasn't just dangerous in their eyes. It was heretical. Desecration of the highest order. Now here's where it gets complicated. One of their own students, a mage named Vanus Galarian, looked at the Psijic Order's entire philosophy of hoarding magical knowledge for an impossibly small elite and said, what if we just didn't do that? Galarian proposed creating the Mages Guild, an organization that would offer magical education and services to basically anyone who could afford it. This was a direct challenge to everything the Psijic Order stood for. Their whole identity was built on restriction. Galarian wanted to blow the doors open, and the the wildest part? Right Master Iakeses proved the charter in 2E230. The leader of the most exclusive magical organization in history signed off on its exact opposite. Whether this was wisdom, resignation, or some kind of long game that nobody else understood, we genuinely don't know. But the Psijics watched their own student democratize everything they'd protected for millennia, and rather than fight it, they just let it happen. And then they disappeared. The Isle of Artaeum, the Psijic Order's home, vanished. Not metaphorically. The entire island ceased to exist in the physical world. It was gone for exactly 500 years before reappearing during the interregnum like nothing had happened. 500 years. That's not hiding. That's removing yourself from reality. The leading theory is that the Psijics possessed some form of temporal magic powerful enough to pull their island out of existence entirely, which is the kind of thing that makes you wonder what else they can do that nobody's ever seen. That's the unease with the Psijic Order. They're not threatening, they're not conquering, they're not even particularly interested in you. But they know things that the rest of Tamriel doesn't, and they've decided the best course of action is to simply not be here. An organization that can erase its own island from the map and come back half a millennium later like they just stepped out for groceries is not an organization you want to underestimate. But if ancient monks hiding on a disappearing island sounds detached from reality, the next faction is the exact opposite. Boots on the ground, swords drawn, and loyalty to the Emperor above all else, the Imperial Legion. The Imperial Legion is the faction everybody takes for granted. It's just there, like gravity or taxes, the massive military machine that held an entire continent together for centuries. And nobody really stops to think about how insane that is until the machine starts breaking down, which is exactly what happened. Here's the thing. The Legion didn't start as some grand institution with a noble charter and a mission statement. It started as Tiber Septim's conquest army around 2E854, a brutal wartime force designed to do one thing, take Tamriel by force. And it worked. Septim carved his way across the continent, and the army that helped him do it gradually evolved into something more permanent. What began as a conquest force became a garrison force, and what began as a garrison force became the single largest military organization Tamriel had ever seen. At peak strength, the Imperial Legion fielded multiple legions spread across every province on the continent, each one thousands of soldiers strong. That's not a military. That's an occupation, and the Legion was proud of this. They proclaimed themselves the most disciplined fighting force in Tamriel's history, and honestly, for a long time, they had the receipts to back it up. Service was open to all Imperial citizens, regardless of race, which was genuinely progressive for a continent where most factions wouldn't let you through the door unless you were the right species. When voluntary recruitment wasn't cutting it, the Empire just conscripted people from nearby cities, which is, not ideal, but it kept the numbers up. The Legion's primary job wasn't conquest, though. That's the part people get wrong. After Tiber Septim finished taking everything, the Legion pivoted to internal security, garrison duty, law enforcement, crushing rebellions before they got out of hand. Legions were stationed across all 9 provinces, keeping the peace in territories that didn't always want to be kept peaceful. The Empire wasn't building an army to invade new territory. It was building an army to keep the territory it already had from falling apart. And for centuries, that worked. The Legion maintained order, suppressed dissent, and projected enough power that most provinces didn't bother testing the Empire's patience. The system functioned because nobody could realistically challenge it. Then the Great War happened, and everything changed. The Aldmeri Dominion didn't just challenge the Legion. They exposed it. The Empire's finest soldiers, the most disciplined military force on the continent, suffered devastating losses across multiple fronts. Entire legions were destroyed in Hammerfell and Cyrodiil. Imperial forces were overwhelmed, retreating through hostile terrain while the Dominion pressed the advantage. This wasn't a tactical withdrawal. This was the moment the entire continent realized the Legion could lose. The white gold concordat that ended the war didn't help. The Empire signed away its dignity to stop the bleeding, banning Talos worship across Imperial territory and disbanding the Blades entirely. The Legion survived, technically, but its reputation took a hit it never recovered from. Provinces that had tolerated Imperial authority for centuries started asking a very uncomfortable question. If the Legion can't beat the Dominion, what exactly is it good for? By the Fourth Era, the answer was increasingly unclear. The Legion found itself fighting the Skyrim Civil War against the Stormcloaks, an insurgency born directly from the Empire's inability to protect its own people from Thalmor religious enforcement. The most powerful military in Tamriel's history was now struggling to hold a single province against its own citizens. Soldiers who should have been preparing for the next war with the Dominion were instead garrisoning Nordic cities and fighting Nords who used to serve alongside them. The Imperial Legion isn't dead, but it's cracking. The institution that held Tamriel together is now visibly struggling to hold itself together, stretched thin across too many fronts with too few resources and a population that's lost faith in the government it serves. The Legion's story isn't one of collapse, not yet. It's one of slow, grinding erosion, where every year the cracks get a little wider and the reinforcements get a little thinner. But if the Legion's decline is concerning, the faction responsible for that decline is downright terrifying. The Thalmor. Here's the thing about the Thalmor. For centuries, they were nobody. Literally, nobody. They existed as a fringe extremist group within Somerset Isle politics, screaming about Altmer supremacy while the rest of the political establishment politely ignored them. Think of that one guy at every town hall meeting who won't stop talking about fluoride in the water. That was the Thalmor for hundreds of years. And then, in the span of a single generation, they became the most dangerous faction on the entire continent. The Oblivion Crisis changed everything. When the Daedric invasions tore through Tamriel and the Empire proved utterly incapable of protecting its own provinces, the Thalmor saw their moment. They claimed credit for saving the Somerset Isles from the Daedric onslaught. Was this exaggerated? Almost certainly. But it didn't matter. The Altmer were terrified. The Empire had just demonstrated catastrophic weakness, and the Thalmor were the only ones saying, "We told you so." That kind of message lands differently when there are still Oblivion gates smoldering in your backyard. The political takeover was swift. The Thalmor consolidated power across the Somerset Isles, then turned outward. Around 4E29, they orchestrated the overthrow of imperial administration in Valenwood, forming the Third Aldmeri Dominion. Shortly after, they brought Elswere's Khajiit kingdoms to heel as client states, not allies, not partners, clients. In less than 30 years, the Thalmor went from political fringe group to the governing authority of 3 provinces, which is, not ideal if you're the Empire, but the Thalmor weren't interested in building a nice little elven coalition and calling it a day. They wanted war. In 4E171, they launched the Great War. By 4E174, the Aldmeri Dominion had thrown their entire military force at the heart of the Empire in a massive gamble, and to make sure the Empire understood exactly what they were dealing with, the Thalmor sent a gift to the Imperial capital: the severed heads of every Blades agent they'd captured and executed, dozens of them, packed up and delivered like a care package. Here are your spies back. We don't need them anymore. That's not a military tactic. That's a statement. The war ended with the White Gold Concordat, and if you think that sounds like a peace treaty, let me correct you. It was a list of demands the Empire was too broken to refuse. Talos worship was outlawed across all Imperial territory. The Blades were formally disbanded, and Thalmor justiciars were granted permission to station themselves within Skyrim to enforce religious compliance. Foreign agents on Imperial soil, arresting Imperial citizens for praying to the wrong god. That's not peace. That's occupation with extra steps. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The Thalmor didn't view the Concordat as a victory. They viewed it as Phase 1. Every piece of intelligence, every interaction with Thalmor leadership in Skyrim points to the same conclusion. The Concordat was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to buy time. Time to rebuild their military. Time to let the Empire rot from the inside. Time to let the Stormcloak Rebellion weaken Imperial forces even further. The Thalmor aren't waiting for peace to hold. They're waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. And that's what makes the Thalmor the perfect faction to end on. Every single organization we've talked about in this video, the Fighters Guild, the Mages Guild, the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, the Blades, the Psijics, the Imperial Legion, every one of them is either dead, fractured, diminished, or in hiding. The Mages Guild split in 2. The Blades were hunted to near extinction. The Psijic Order vanished entirely. And standing over all of it, patient and calculating, are the Thalmor, the faction that nobody took seriously for centuries. The faction that exploited every other faction's decline to claw their way to the top. Tamriel isn't at peace. It's in a countdown, and the Thalmor are the ones holding the clock. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every crime in Skyrim explained, click the video on the screen now.